Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It all began in the late autumn of last year, a time when the air turned crisp and the days were just short enough to hint at the long, dark nights ahead. I'd been living in a small, quiet town nestled against a sprawling forest for most of my adult life. To be honest, I was the kind of guy who enjoyed his solitude. Between my job at the local library and my occasional weekend hikes, I rarely found myself needing much company. This story starts with an innocent decision, a hike on a Saturday morning. It wasn't out of the ordinary for me to spend my weekends trekking the trails. I liked the quiet of the woods, the way the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, and the faint rustle of leaves underfoot. The forest, I believed, was a place of simplicity, free from the noise and chaos of daily life. I'd been planning this particular hike for a while. There was a section of the woods I hadn't explored, an area about 3 miles off the main trail. The path wasn't on any official maps, but I'd heard whispers about it from an older man at the library who'd lived in the town his whole life. He told me that this part of the forest was special, though he never elaborated. It was enough to pique my curiosity. That morning, I packed my essentials: a sturdy pair of boots, a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and my notebook. Writing had always been a hobby of mine, and I often jotted down my thoughts or sketches of the landscapes I encountered. My dog, Rocky, a loyal shepherd mix, wagged his tail in excitement as we set off. Rocky had been my companion for years, and he never missed a hike. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, a 20-minute stretch of winding roads framed by towering pines and maples. The town faded in my rearview mirror as the forest loomed larger. It felt comforting, like entering a familiar embrace. I parked my truck in the gravel lot, shouldered my pack, and stepped onto the trail with Rocky trotting ahead. The forest was alive in a way that only those who've been truly alone in nature can understand. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the sound of distant birdsong accompanied us as we walked. For the first mile, the trail was well trodden, but soon it began to narrow, its edges creeping with moss and tangled roots. As we pushed further into the woods, I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind of quiet that envelops you when you're far from civilization. Rocky seemed to feel it too. His usual playful energy was subdued as he walked close by my side, ears occasionally twitching at some distant sound. By noon, we reached a clearing where I decided to stop and rest. The sunlight poured through the gaps in the trees, warming the cool air. I poured myself a cup of coffee and scribbled some notes in my journal while Rocky nosed around the edges of the clearing. There was something peaceful about the moment, a stillness that felt rare. After a short break, I consulted my map, or rather, the rough sketch I'd made based on the old man's directions. The path ahead was faint, barely distinguishable from the forest floor, but I was determined to see where it led. The further we went, the denser the trees became, their branches intertwining overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. By mid-afternoon, the trail had all but disappeared, leaving me to navigate by instinct and the occasional marker carved into tree trunks. The air grew cooler, and the light began to shift, casting longer shadows. It wasn't unsettling, at least, not yet. It felt more like the forest was inviting me deeper, urging me to see what lay beyond the familiar trails. As we walked, I noticed small details that seemed out of place. A cluster of stones stacked in a deliberate formation, a tree with symbols etched into its bark. They were subtle, easy to dismiss as the remnants of some old camping trip or the work of an eccentric hiker. I paused to examine one of the carvings, running my fingers over the rough grooves. It didn't look recent, but something about it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Rocky let out a low growl, snapping me out of my thoughts. He was staring ahead, his body rigid and his ears pinned back. I couldn't see what had caught his attention, but his reaction was enough to make me uneasy. I called him back, and he hesitated before returning to my side. We continued, though my earlier sense of calm had been replaced by a quiet unease. The forest seemed different now, as if it were watching. The sounds of birds had faded, replaced by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. Even Rocky, who usually charged ahead with boundless enthusiasm, stuck close to my heels. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow through the trees. I checked my watch. It was later than I'd planned, and I considered turning back. But something kept me moving forward, a nagging curiosity I couldn't shake. Then, just as the last rays of sunlight began to disappear, I saw it. Through the trees, barely visible in the growing shadows, was a structure. It was small, weathered, and partially obscured by the underbrush. And that's where it all began. The moment I spotted the structure, I froze in my tracks. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. It was barely distinguishable from the forest around it, hidden behind a curtain of vines and brambles. The cabin, or what seemed to be a cabin, had the appearance of something long abandoned. Its weathered wooden walls were darkened with age, and the roof sagged under the weight of moss and decay. Rocky's reaction was immediate and uncharacteristic. He stiffened beside me, his ears flattened, and a low, guttural growl rising from his throat. His eyes were fixed on the structure, unblinking. This was unlike him. Rocky was a friendly, adventurous dog who usually showed more curiosity than caution. I placed a reassuring hand on his back, but the tension in his muscles didn't ease. "Easy, boy," I murmured, though my own voice betrayed my unease. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an old hunting cabin, long forgotten and left to nature. Maybe some hiker had built it decades ago and never returned. I reminded myself that strange things can seem ominous when you're out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the unknown. Still, there was something about the place that didn't sit right with me. The way it seemed almost out of place, like it didn't belong here in this forest, or maybe it wasn't supposed to be found. I hesitated, torn between my curiosity and a growing sense of apprehension. The sensible part of me wanted to turn around, to retrace my steps back to the safety of the trail. But another part of me, the same part that had driven me to explore this unmarked path in the first place, urged me to move closer. Rocky didn't share my curiosity. As I took a cautious step forward, he let out a sharp bark, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. I'd never seen him act this way, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Stay," I said, my voice firmer now. Rocky didn't move, but his growling continued, low and steady. I approached the cabin slowly, my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves and twigs underfoot. The closer I got, the more unsettling the place became. The air seemed heavier, thicker somehow, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped to take it all in. The cabin was small, just a single room by the look of it, with a single window that had long since been shattered. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. What struck me most was the silence. The forest, which had been alive with the faint hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves, was now eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. I called out, my voice sounding strange and out of place in the oppressive quiet. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The words hung in the air for a moment before fading into nothingness. There was no response, no sound of movement from within the cabin. Despite the lack of any obvious threat, my unease grew. It wasn't just the cabin itself, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was watching me from just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned back to Rocky, who was still rooted in place, his body tense and his eyes locked on the cabin. "It's okay, boy," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Steeling myself, I stepped closer. The door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and rot. The sunlight barely penetrated the cabin, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and flicker. I hesitated in the doorway, peering inside. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and a tangle of debris on the floor. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw it. A single item sitting on a rickety table in the corner of the room. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked with age. It didn't make sense for it to be there. Everything else in the cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but the notebook was relatively clean, as if someone had placed it there recently. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the table. Reaching out, I picked up the notebook, its leather cover cool and smooth against my fingertips. As I opened it, I realized the pages were filled with handwritten entries. The writing was neat but hurried, the ink slightly smudged in places. It wasn't in English, though at least not entirely. The words were a mix of what looked like Latin and something else, a language I couldn't recognize. I flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of it. Most of it was illegible to me, but there were a few sketches scattered throughout strange symbols and crude drawings of what appeared to be the forest. A sudden sound broke the silence, and I nearly dropped the notebook. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I turned toward the door, my eyes scanning the clearing outside. There was no one there, no movement except for the faint rustling of the leaves. But I knew what I'd heard. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice trembling. "Silence!" Rocky barked from where he was still standing, his body rigid and his eyes wide. He wasn't barking at the cabin anymore. He was barking at something behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. My grip tightened on the notebook as I backed away toward the door. Something wasn't right. The air felt colder now, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed darker, more oppressive. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, watching me, waiting. I stepped outside, the fresh air hitting me like a wave. Rocky rushed to my side, his tail still tucked and his body trembling. I didn't have to say anything. He was already leading the way back the way we'd come, his nose to the ground, as if trying to escape something unseen. As we made our way back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. Just the trees, their gnarled branches twisting against the darkening sky. By the time we reached the trailhead and the safety of my truck, the sun had set completely, leaving the forest bathed in shadow. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon, but one thing was certain. That cabin, and whatever it held, was not meant to be found. That night, back at home, the sense of unease refused to leave me. Rocky was no better. He paced the living room, occasionally stopping to growl at the window or sniff the air as if searching for something unseen. I found myself absently staring at the notebook I had placed on the kitchen counter. Its presence felt heavier than its physical weight, as though it carried more than just ink and paper within its pages. I decided to take a closer look. Sitting at the table, I flipped through the notebook under the bright kitchen light, hoping it would demystify the eerie aura it carried. The language remained inscrutable, but the sketches demanded my attention. One particular drawing stood out, a crude map, marked with symbols and lines that vaguely resembled the area I had been exploring earlier that day. A circle was drawn around what I guessed was the clearing with the cabin. Beneath the map were several rows of symbols arranged in a pattern that seemed intentional, almost ritualistic. I couldn't make sense of them, but their placement suggested they weren't just random doodles. Then I saw it, a single English word scrawled across the bottom of one page. It was written hastily, as if an afterthought, but it stood out starkly against the cryptic text. "Stay!" My stomach tightened. Was it a warning? A command? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had stumbled upon the cabin before me, just like I had, and left this notebook as a way to document their findings. Maybe they'd written "stay" to urge others to leave it alone, to avoid the same unease they'd felt. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less certain I became. As the hours stretched on, the notebook seemed to take on a life of its own. Rocky wouldn't go near it, skirting around the table and whining softly whenever he passed it. At one point, I swore I heard faint scratching, like the sound of fingernails dragging across the counter. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Sleep came reluctantly that night. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with the forest. The cabin loomed large in my mind, its dark windows like eyes staring back at me. In the dream, I stood frozen outside the cabin as shadows spilled out from its doorway, reaching for me with elongated, grasping fingers. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of Rocky's barking jolting me fully awake. He was at the front door, his hackles raised, barking at something outside. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously opened the door. The night was still, the air crisp and silent. There was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. But Rocky wouldn't stop rolling, his gaze fixed on the tree line at the edge of the yard. I aimed the flashlight in the direction he was staring, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "There's nothing there, boy," I said, my voice unconvincing even to myself. Rocky didn't relax until I brought him back inside and locked the door behind us. Even then, he stayed by my side, his body tense and his eyes darting toward the windows. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest that had always felt like a second home now felt foreign, alien. The thought of the cabin lingered in my mind, gnawing at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back. I told myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity, to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, then headed back to the trailhead with Rocky reluctantly in tow. The hike to the cabin felt different this time. The forest seemed quieter, the air heavier. Even the sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, as though the canopy above was conspiring to keep the ground below in perpetual shadow. When we reached the clearing, the cabin looked exactly as it had before dark, silent and oppressive. But something was different. The door, which I had left slightly ajar, was now fully closed. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. I approached cautiously, Rocky growling low in his throat with every step I took. When I reached the cabin, I placed a hand on the door. It felt colder than it should have, as though the wood itself was leaching warmth from my skin. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The interior was just as I'd left it, empty and decaying. But now, there were more items on the table. Alongside the notebook were several more pages, yellowed and brittle, covered in the same cryptic writing. They hadn't been there before. A faint sound reached my ears, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. It was a whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. It seemed to come from all around me, yet nowhere at once. "Leave!" The word was soft, drawn out, and unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but as I did, something caught my eye, shadow moving in the corner of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow wasn't cast by anything in the room. It moved independently, shifting and stretching against the wall as though it had a mind of its own. Rocky's barking snapped me out of my trance. He was at the doorway, his teeth bared, and his growls louder than ever. I didn't need any more convincing. Grabbing the notebook and the loose pages, I bolted from the cabin. Rocky was already ahead of me, his paws kicking up dirt as he raced toward the trail. As I ran, I felt something behind me. The sensation was undeniable, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. I threw the notebook into the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot without a second glance. Back home, I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains tight. Rocky stayed by my side, his body trembling with residual fear. I didn't know what I had unleashed or what I had brought back with me, but one thing was clear. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was something more, something dangerous. The morning after I returned from the cabin, I found the notebook and loose pages lying on the kitchen counter where I had left them. Only now, the scribbled symbols and diagrams had changed. The ink appeared fresh, as though someone or something had rewritten the contents overnight. The once indiscernible symbols now seemed to pulsate with a strange energy, and faint lines had been added to the drawings, giving the impression of a figure emerging from the chaotic lines. It wasn't human. The figure appeared skeletal, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at me, no matter where I stood. I stared at the notebook for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I finally tore my gaze away, Rocky was standing at the far end of the kitchen, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. He didn't move or make a sound, but his wide eyes were fixed on the notebook, his body trembling. That's when the banging started. It came from the front door, 3 loud, deliberate knocks that reverberated through the house. My heart leaped into my throat. Rocky let out a low growl, his ears pinned back as he darted to my side. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my pulse thundering in my ears. The knocking came again, harder this time. Bang, bang, bang. Grabbing the pocket knife I'd taken on the hike, I edged toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, but no one was there. The moment I turned the deadbolt, the door flew open with a force that sent me stumbling backward. The porch was empty, but the air was ice cold, and a faint whispering sound filled my ears. It was the same voice I'd heard in the cabin, only now it was clearer, more insistent. You shouldn't have come back. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once. As I stepped back into the house, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I saw the shadow. It was no longer confined to the cabin. It moved through my living room like a living entity, stretching across the walls and ceiling, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of smoke. In its center were 2 pinpoints of light, faint but unmistakable. Eyes! Rocky barked furiously, lunging toward the shadow, but it recoiled, its form shifting and expanding until it seemed to fill the entire room. The voice came again, louder now. You brought it here. You will pay. The notebook on the counter burst into flames, the fire casting an eerie glow across the room. The pages burned, but instead of being consumed, the flames seemed to feed the shadow, making it grow larger and more defined. Suddenly, the room began to shake. Picture frames fell from the walls, and the furniture groaned under the weight of some unseen force. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Then, the shadow lunged. It moved with impossible speed, enveloping me in darkness. I felt an overwhelming pressure, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, and a searing pain shot through my head, as though the shadow were trying to invade my thoughts. I screamed, the sound raw and primal, but it felt distant, like it was coming from someone else. The fear was all-consuming. I wasn't just afraid of dying. I was afraid of what it would do to me if I let it win. The shadow wasn't just a physical presence. It was a force, ancient and malevolent, and it wanted something from me. Why? I choked out, my voice barely audible over the deafening silence. The shadow seemed to pause, its form shifting as though it were considering my question. For a moment, the pressure eased, and I felt a sliver of hope. Then it spoke again, its voice a guttural rasp that sent chills down my spine. You opened the door. With those words, a flood of memories surged into my mind, not just my own, but something far older. Visions of the cabin's past, of people drawn to it just as I had been. I saw them standing in the same clearing, holding the same notebook, their faces twisted in terror as the shadow consumed them one by one. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. A lure for anyone curious enough to step inside, to take the notebook and unknowingly unleash the shadow upon themselves. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of my mistake bore down on me. I had brought this thing into my home, into my life, and now it was going to destroy me. But then, something changed. Rocky, My loyal companion lunged at the shadow with a ferocity I had never seen before. His teeth snapped and his growls were deafening, and for the first time, the shadow seemed to falter. It recoiled slightly, its form flickering as though weakened. "Rocky, no!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. His attack gave me just enough time to act. My eyes darted to the notebook, still burning on the counter. Without thinking, I grabbed it, ignoring the searing pain as the flames licked at my skin. The moment my hands touched the pages, the shadow let out an ear-piercing screech. It writhed and twisted, its form collapsing in on itself as though the notebook were pulling it back. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw the notebook into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, engulfing the pages completely. The shadow let out one final, deafening wail before it disappeared, sucked into the flames along with the notebook. The room fell silent. The shaking stopped, and the lights flickered back on. I collapsed to the floor, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. Rocky was by my side in an instant, his body trembling, but his eyes full of concern. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The notebook was gone, and with it, the shadow. But the fear lingered, etched into my very being. I knew I would never go near that cabin again. But deep down, I also knew the shadow wasn't truly gone. It was part of the cabin, part of the forest, and it would wait for its next victim. And whoever that person might be, I could only hope they'd be strong enough to fight it. When the smoke from the fireplace dissipated, silence settled over my house. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that prickles at the edge of your senses, leaving you unsure if you're truly alone. I sat on the floor, gripping Rocky tightly as his trembling began to ease. His soft fur against my hand was the only grounding sensation in a world that felt foreign and broken. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warm glow starkly contrasting with the icy dread still curling in my gut. The notebook was gone, reduced to ash. And yet, I didn't feel relief. There was no triumphant moment, no assurance that the ordeal was truly over. I kept glancing around the room, expecting the shadow to reform, to creep back into the corners. But nothing moved. The house was still, though it felt far from safe. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me. Rocky stayed glued to my side, his eyes darting toward every shadow as though expecting it to strike. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were burdened with the residue of what had happened. I spent the next few hours methodically checking every inch of my home, flashlight in hand. The furniture was still overturned, and shards of broken picture frames littered the floor, but there were no signs of the shadow. The air, though heavy, no longer carried that unnatural chill. Despite this, I couldn't bring myself to sit in the dark. Every light in the house stayed on, and I kept Rocky close. Exhaustion gnawed at me, but I couldn't sleep. Instead, I cleaned sweeping up glass, righting chairs, and scrubbing the scorched edges of the fireplace until my hands ached. It was a futile attempt to erase the memory of the shadow's presence, but I needed something to do, something to anchor myself in the real world. When dawn broke, the pale light filtering through the windows felt like salvation. I opened the curtains wide, letting the sunlight flood in, chasing away the shadows that seemed far too ominous now. For the first time since entering the cabin, I felt like I could breathe. But the relief was short-lived. As I sipped my coffee that morning, staring at the ash-streaked fireplace, the questions began to creep in. Why had the shadow been there? What had drawn it to that cabin? And why did it seem tied to the notebook? The visions I'd seen when the shadow invaded my mind haunted me. The people from the past, their terrified faces, their desperate attempts to escape it all felt too vivid to dismiss. It was as if the cabin itself was a living thing, a trap designed to ensnare anyone curious or foolish enough to enter. But why? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of something far darker and more ancient than I could comprehend. The notebook was gone, but the cabin still stood, hidden in the woods, waiting. I thought about calling someone, friends, authorities, anyone who might help, but what could I say? That a shadow had followed me home and nearly killed me? That a cursed notebook had burned away in my fireplace? The story sounded insane, even to me. And besides, what could anyone do? The shadow was gone, for now, but the cabin was still out there, and I had no doubt it would claim another victim someday. The thought left me hollow. I had escaped, but someone else might not be so lucky. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. The shadows felt too oppressive, too alive. I packed a bag, grabbed Rocky's leash, and left without looking back. I drove aimlessly for hours, the highway stretching endlessly before me. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to get as far away as possible. Rocky sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on my lap. His presence was the only thing keeping me grounded. I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. The room was small and dingy, but it felt safer than home. I locked the door, checked the windows, and left the lights on as I curled up on the bed with Rocky beside me. For the first time in days, I managed a few hours of restless sleep. But the dreams came visions of the cabin, the shadow, the notebook. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It was clear that I couldn't outrun what had happened. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I stayed in motels, hopping from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. I avoided the woods, even the smallest patches of trees. But no matter where I went, I felt at the cabin's pull. It wasn't physical, but a gnawing sensation at the back of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't remove. The shadow might have been gone, but the cabin wasn't finished with me. I started noticing odd things. Shadows that lingered a second too long, faint whispers in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, but constant, a reminder that I had opened a door I couldn't close. One night, in another nameless motel room, I found myself scrolling through online forums, searching for answers. I typed out my story, careful not to include too many details, and posted it anonymously. The responses poured in, most dismissive, some curious, a few downright hostile. But one stood out, a message from someone claiming to have seen the cabin too. They didn't give much detail, but their description matched mine exactly. They ended their message with a chilling warning. You can't run from it. Once you've seen it, it's always with you. The days turned into weeks, and I found myself living in a constant state of vigilance. Even the smallest, most mundane moments were tinged with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that some part of the cabin's darkness had followed me, hidden just beyond my line of sight. It wasn't like the shadow that had loomed in my house. It was subtler, quieter, but just as menacing. A misplaced object, the faint sound of footsteps when I was alone, or Rocky's sudden growl at an empty corner of the room. These occurrences became my new normal. I tried to settle into a routine, moving from place to place, keeping myself and Rocky safe. But the truth was, I no longer trusted the world around me. Everything felt tainted, like I was living in a cracked mirror version of reality, one where shadows might stretch too far, or the quiet might hold hidden threats. I thought often about the cabin. Not a day went by when it didn't creep into my mind. It wasn't just fear, it was fascination, an almost compulsive need to understand what had happened. Who had built it? What was its purpose? And why had it chosen me? I returned to those forums, delving into similar stories. There were more than I expected accounts of strange cabins, cursed objects, and unexplained shadows. Some were outlandish, filled with obvious embellishments, but others had a chilling authenticity that struck too close to home. One story described a man who had seen the same type of shadow, but in a different part of the country. He claimed it had followed him for years, feeding on his fear, growing stronger until it consumed him entirely. The post was old, and there were no follow-ups. It was a grim possibility that kept me up at night. Despite the lingering fear, there were moments of clarity, brief instances where I felt almost normal. Rocky was a constant source of comfort, his presence grounding me when my mind threatened to spiral. His trust reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone in this. I began to write, documenting every detail of what had happened. It wasn't for closure, I wasn't sure that was even possible, but as a way to make sense of it all. The process was agonizing, dredging up memories I would have preferred to bury. But it also brought a sense of control, however small, over something that had rendered me powerless. Writing helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before, connections between the cabin's sinister presence and the stories I'd found. It was as if the cabin was a magnet for despair, drawing in those who were already vulnerable and amplifying their fears until they broke. For the past 2 years, I've worked the night shift as a security guard at an old, massive building downtown. It's a job that many people would consider boring and monotonous, but for me, it was more than just a paycheck. It was the kind of work that allowed me to be alone, which I preferred. I'd clock in at 11 p.m., take my seat at the security desk, and wait for the quiet night to pass. The building itself was a relic of a past era. Built in the 1950s, it had all the hallmarks of a time gone by. Worn marble floors, heavy wood doors, and grand windows that let in only a sliver of light during the night. The place had character, but it was also eerie. Maybe it was the creaking of the floors as the old structure settled, or the echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. Most people would avoid working there at night, but for me, it was simply a routine. A job I did without thinking much about it. The staff consisted of just a handful of people, and during the night shift, I was the only one on duty. The night felt peaceful, predictable until one evening, when everything changed. I didn't know it at the time, but that night would mark the beginning of something strange that I still can't explain. At first, nothing out of the ordinary happened. My shift started as usual. I walked into the security office, a small room in the back corner of the building. It had a single desk, a computer, a few monitors showing different areas of the building, and an old chair that squeaked whenever you moved in it. I sat down and flipped the switch to activate the security cameras. Everything seemed to be in order. Nothing was out of place, and the hum of the building's air conditioning was the only sound that filled the room. I glanced through the monitors, just routine checks. The main hall, the stairwell, the offices. Everything appeared normal. I checked the clock, noting that it was around 11:30 p.m. Another slow night ahead, or so I thought. The quiet was comforting, and I let my eyes wander back to the screens. The night was typical, just a man sitting in front of security monitors, sipping coffee every now and then, and occasionally standing up to stretch. There was a rhythm to it, something comforting about the way the hours passed without incident. The calmness of the building was almost soothing, which was something I hadn't realized I appreciated until that first strange event unfolded. I should also mention the history of the building. Though I never gave it much thought, I knew there were rumors. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened inside the walls. I wasn't one to buy into those stories. People like to tell tales about old buildings, and it was easy to dismiss them when you were standing in front of a set of security cameras that showed nothing but empty halls. But after working there for a few months, I began to wonder. Not because I believed in the supernatural, but because of the strange little moments that couldn't be explained. The things I tried to brush off, telling myself they were just the quirks of an old building. It was a particularly cold night, even for the winter months, and I found myself drawn to the small space heater in the corner of the room. I noticed the time, almost 1 a.m. The building was silent, aside from the faint buzz of the lights above me. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window that looked out onto the alley. Just as I was about to take a sip of coffee, something caught my eye. The flicker of movement in the hallway outside the office, just for a second. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. My heart skipped a beat. There shouldn't have been anyone in the building at this time of night. The only people allowed in were the cleaning crew, and they finished up hours ago. I stared at the hallway monitor, but the image was still. There was no one there. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if it was just the light playing tricks on me. I leaned forward, staring hard at the monitor. Nothing. Maybe it was just the building settling, or my mind playing tricks. It's easy to imagine things in the quiet of the night. I sighed and returned to my chair, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Still, a small part of me felt unsettled, as though I couldn't quite put the incident behind me. The rest of the night passed without much else, just the usual monotony. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time my shift ended at 7 a.m., I was ready to leave, though a small part of me lingered on that moment. I had chalked it up to exhaustion, or maybe even a trick of the light. But as I walked out of the building that morning, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The hallway was empty, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The first unsettling incident occurred just a few nights after the strange flicker I had noticed. At first, I thought I had imagined it a product of the long hours, the quiet, and the isolation of being the only one in the building. But when the strange occurrences began to repeat themselves, I knew something was off. It was a Wednesday night, just like any other. I arrived at the building a little earlier than usual, eager to settle in and get the shift started. The cold air hit me as I stepped inside, the hum of the lights overhead greeting me. The office was quiet, and I made my way to my usual seat by the security monitors. The building felt the same as always, empty, still, and oddly comforting. The security system blinked to life as I flicked the switch, displaying the various angles of the cameras in different sections of the building. I began my usual routine, checking the monitors, glancing at the clock, sipping my coffee, and half watching the silent images of empty rooms. The hours drifted by as I sorted through paperwork and caught up on any small tasks that had accumulated throughout the day. I hadn't thought much about the strange flicker from the other night. It was just a shadow or a light anomaly, nothing more. It wasn't until the clock hit 2 a.m. that things took a strange turn. It started with a soft sound, nothing loud, but noticeable if you were paying attention. It was like a faint tapping noise, coming from somewhere deep in the hallway. I paused, listening closely. The sound continued, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It didn't fit the usual noises of the building. The pipes would sometimes groan, and the wind outside would cause a slight creaking in the walls, but this was different. The tapping was precise, almost deliberate. I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes fixed on the hallway monitor. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it should be. The sound, however, persisted. I was about to brush it off, assuming it was just another oddity of the old building, when I noticed something else. A shadow flickering in and out of view at the end of the hallway. I stared at the screen, heart pounding in my chest. The shadow didn't move like a person. It was more fluid, like it was bending and twisting in a way that wasn't natural. I watched as the shadow seemed to stretch, elongating and shortening in a way that defied explanation. My breath caught in my throat as the tapping continued, now louder and more pronounced, as though whoever or whatever was making the noise was getting closer. I quickly glanced at the clock on the wall, 2:15 a.m. A chill ran down my spine as the tapping stopped, and the shadow seemed to vanish altogether. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the lights or my mind playing games with me after hours of staring at security monitors. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, walking toward the hallway where the shadow had appeared. The building was silent now, the only sound the faint shuffle of my footsteps on the old, worn floors. My heart was racing in my chest as I moved deeper into the building, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I reached the end of the hallway, where the security cameras had shown the shadow, but there was nothing there. The area was empty, just another cold, lifeless part of the building. But something didn't feel right. The air was thick with tension, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. But again, there was nothing. The tapping had stopped, the shadow had vanished, and the hallway looked like it always did, empty and still. I returned to the security office, my mind racing with questions. Had I really seen something? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The lights flickered overhead, and I felt a strange sensation crawling up my spine. I glanced at the monitors again. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat back down at my desk, trying to shake off the growing unease in my chest. The rest of the night passed slowly. The tapping never returned, and the shadow never appeared again. But I couldn't forget it. That night, I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I was being watched. The building felt different somehow, as if the walls were closing in on me. And when I finally clocked out at 7 a.m., the sense of unease lingered. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe exhaustion. The job had been taking a toll on me. Still, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced as I walked out of the building, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The strange part was that no one else had ever noticed anything unusual. No one ever commented on hearing strange sounds or seeing anything out of place. But that night, the unsettling incident marked the beginning of a series of strange events that I couldn't ignore. And with each passing night, the tension in the building seemed to grow. As I drove home that morning, I couldn't help but wonder if I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a product of the long hours and isolation. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Something was in that building with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just getting started. The nights after the first unsettling incident grew increasingly uncomfortable. Each shift felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of something unseen pressed down on the building. The strange occurrences didn't stop, and they didn't stay subtle. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me again, but the incidents became so frequent that it was impossible to dismiss them as mere coincidences. It started with the sound again, the tapping, the rhythmic knocking that echoed through the halls late into the night. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the wind creaking through the walls or pipes. But this time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one place. Either it moved around the building, coming from different hallways, and even the rooms. Every time I thought I had pinpointed the source, it would shift, always just out of sight. A feeling of dread slowly crawled over me as I listened to it echoing in the dead of night. The sound was becoming almost familiar, like it was taunting me, daring me to confront it. Then there were the lights. They began to flicker more regularly, but now it wasn't just the usual quirks of old wiring. No, this was different. The lights would blink out completely for a few seconds, plunging me into an unsettling darkness, only to flash back on, as though someone or something was playing with the electrical system. The first few times, I assumed a malfunction, but when it started happening regularly every few hours, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I would sit in the darkness, my flashlight illuminating nothing but the emptiness around me, and the tapping would grow louder, sharper, almost angry. The cameras also began to act strangely. Sometimes, the footage would cut to static, showing nothing but a garbled screen of snow. But there were moments when the screens would show a perfect, clear image of empty hallways, and for a fraction of a second, a figure would appear in the frame, standing still and staring. By the time I blinked or moved to get a closer look, the figure would be gone, and the hallways would be empty again. It happened so quickly that I almost convinced myself it was just the fatigue getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One particular night, it happened again. I was sitting in the security office, reviewing the footage from the earlier hours. The clock read 3:15 a.m. The usual quiet had fallen over the building. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, as though it was weighed down by something unseen. I was staring at the monitor when a flicker of movement caught my eye, just a blur in the corner of the screen. I froze, watching as the blurry shape materialized into something more solid. A figure, dressed in a long coat, stood at the far end of the hallway. I couldn't make out any distinct features. The figure simply stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for something or someone. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly clicked the switch to another camera angle, hoping to get a better view of who or what it was. But when I cycled through the cameras, the hallway was empty again. There was no one there. I couldn't explain it. I had just seen something. My hands trembled as I adjusted the camera feeds, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The figure had vanished. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck as I sat back in my chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe the lighting had played some part in this strange distortion. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had to investigate. The building felt suffocating, and my sense of dread was growing with each passing minute. The curiosity was eating at me, pulling me forward, even though my instincts screamed at me to run. I grabbed my flashlight once again and stepped out of the security office. The building was eerily quiet as I walked down the hallway. My footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows that seemed to move on their own, and every corner I turned felt like a potential trap. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the hallway where the figure had appeared earlier. The space was just as empty as before. I stood in the middle of the corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping over the walls. Nothing, but the air was thick, colder than it had been before. A chill crept up my spine as I walked further, every step making me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. The tapping started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. I was nearly at the end of the hall when the lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands trembling uncontrollably. It felt as if the entire building had gone still, like it was holding its breath. I turned on the flashlight, and for a moment, the beam illuminated nothing but the empty corridor ahead of me. But then I saw it a movement, just at the edge of my light. I froze. There, standing at the far end of the hall, was the figure again. The same tall, dark shape, its head slightly tilted, as if it were studying me. The figure's presence was unnerving, and I could feel my breath catch in my chest. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't stand frozen in disbelief. I turned and ran. My footsteps pounded against the floor, echoing through the hall as I sprinted back to the security office. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't want to see what might be following me, or worse, what might have been watching me the entire time. I collapsed into the chair in front of the monitors, staring at the empty hallways on the screen. The tapping had stopped. The building felt eerily quiet again, but I knew that whatever was in that place with me wasn't gone. It was still there, watching, waiting. The rest of that shift was a blur. I don't remember much of it, just sitting there, wide-eyed, staring at the monitors, hoping that I wouldn't see anything else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The building wasn't just empty anymore. It was alive with something dark and restless, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay there without losing my mind. That night, I drove home with my hands still shaking on the wheel, but my mind couldn't escape the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. Something in that building was awake, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. By the time I arrived at work the next night, I was already on edge. The events of the previous shift had shaken me to my core, and every creak, every shift in the air felt like an ominous warning. My body was tense, hyper-aware of everything around me as I entered the building. The usual chill in the air felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed too loud in the otherwise quiet building, and my footsteps echoed unnervingly through the halls. I told myself that I had to finish my shift. I had to stay. I couldn't let whatever was in the building win. The fear gnawing at me had only deepened with every shift, but there was something else now, a strange sense of determination. I had to know what was happening, why these things were happening. I couldn't just sit in the security room, waiting for something to find me. I had to confront it head on. I was barely a few hours into the shift when the strange occurrences began again. It started with the cameras. I was reviewing footage from earlier that evening when the screen suddenly flickered and went to static. I tried to adjust the controls, but nothing worked. I looked up at the screens, hoping for the usual grainy footage to come back, but all I saw was a wall of white noise. I slammed my fist down on the desk in frustration, my heart rate quickening. I grabbed the camera control panel, but before I could do anything else, the screen flickered again. And then, For just a moment, the static cleared. I stared in disbelief. There, standing in the middle of one of the hallways, was the figure. It was clearer now, taller, more defined. The figure was in a long, dark coat, its face obscured by shadows, but I could make out the shape of its body, its movement. It was unnaturally still, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at it, frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. The air grew thick, and I suddenly felt a burning pressure in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the panic button, my fingers trembling as I pressed it down hard. The security lights above flickered, dimming, and then went out altogether. The building was plunged into darkness. My flashlight was the only thing that kept the shadows at bay as I rushed out of the office, my feet moving before I even had a chance to think. I was no longer just terrified, I was desperate. I had to know what this was. Who or what was haunting me? I found myself back at the same hallway where the figure had appeared on the screen. The building was eerily quiet, the usual hum of the lights gone, replaced by an unsettling silence that made my skin crawl. I stepped forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark, my heartbeat louder than my footsteps. I moved slowly, cautiously, as though I were walking into the mouth of a predator's den. And then I heard it. The tapping, louder than before, closer. It echoed through the hallways like a sickening rhythm, sharp, deliberate. I followed the sound, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I turned the corner, my breath shallow and quick. The hallway stretched before me, empty, but the sound, it was growing nearer. I reached the end of the hallway, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. I could feel my body trembling, my stomach twisted in knots. My fingers were numb, my flashlight flickering. And then, as if on cue, the lights overhead went out completely, leaving me in pitch black darkness. I wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw it just a flicker at first, a movement in the shadow. The figure stepped out of the darkness, its form solidifying as it approached me. The tapping had stopped, but the air had grown cold frigid, and every part of my body screamed at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught between terror and something else I couldn't quite name. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me, evaluating me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath, a desperate plea for answers. It didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence so overwhelming that I could hardly stand to look at it. I could feel my knees shaking beneath me, the sweat on my brow turning cold. And then, in a voice that was barely audible, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The voice was distorted, guttural, as though it was coming from somewhere far away. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what was happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as the figure took another step toward me, I knew it was. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was going to make sure I paid the price for my curiosity. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I could feel the air around me thickening, pressing against my chest. The darkness around me felt alive, like it was swallowing me whole. The figure's face was still hidden, but I could feel its gaze on me. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. And then, the lights flickered back on. For a moment, I was blinded by the sudden brightness, but when my vision cleared, I was alone. The hallway was empty. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. But the figure was gone, and the oppressive air had lifted, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was disoriented, confused. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. Had it been real? Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? I couldn't tell anymore. But then I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the darkness at the end of the hall. It was coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I bolted. My body moved without thought, propelled by pure panic. I ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip as I sprinted down the halls, desperate to escape whatever nightmare I had found myself in. But the tapping followed me. Closer and closer. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my breaths ragged and panicked, the flashlight trembling violently in my hand. The tapping behind me, sharp and methodical, echoed in the otherwise silent halls, growing nearer with each desperate step I took. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as if every part of me was screaming to get out. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this building, alone in the dark, with whatever thing was following me. I reached the security room, my mind racing as I fumbled for the door handle, slamming the door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place, but I didn't feel safe. The tapping, still rhythmic and deliberate, seemed to be getting louder, surrounding me. I pressed my back against the door, my heart thundering in my chest, each breath a struggle. My flashlight flickered, and I quickly grabbed the backup flashlight in the drawer, praying it would hold. There was no time to process what had happened, no time to think about what I had just seen or heard. All I knew was that I needed to get out. But how? I was trapped. The exit was locked from the inside, and I couldn't leave without triggering the alarm. My mind raced through possible scenarios, but each one felt like it only pushed me further into panic. I had to face it. The thought was terrifying. After everything that had happened, part of me wanted to run and never come back. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. This thing, it wasn't going to let me leave until I figured out what it wanted, why it was here. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the security monitors again. The screens were still flickering, but as my gaze locked on the footage, something stopped me cold. The figure. It was there, standing in the same hallway where I had seen it earlier, but it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, walking slowly toward the camera, as though it was aware that I was watching. I froze. My heart seemed to stop, my breath shallow as I stared at the screen. Was it looking at me? In that moment, I knew what I had to do. There was no escaping it, no hiding from it. I had to confront whatever this was, face to face. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed the walkie-talkie and pressed it to my lips. My voice was barely a whisper, shaky, but I had to speak. I had to find a way to communicate with someone, anyone, outside the building. This is security. I need help. There's something in here. Something. I don't know what it is, but it's real. The walkie-talkie crackled, but no one answered. The silence that followed was deafening. I had no choice but to leave the security room. My legs felt like jelly as I forced myself to move, stepping back into the dimly lit hallway. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt heavier now charged, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked, each footstep echoing louder than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the building had become a living, breathing thing, its cold walls and dark corners closing in on me. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning every shadow, every darkened doorway. It was then that I heard it again. A faint scraping sound, coming from behind a closed door on my right. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath itching. I knew that sound. It was the same as before the tapping, the footsteps. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I had to see it through, whatever it was. Slowly, I reached out to the door, my hand trembling as I touched the cold handle. The door creaked as I turned it, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the hallway, magnifying my fear. I pushed it open. The room was empty. At first glance, it seemed like any other storage room, dimly lit, filled with forgotten boxes and old equipment. But there was something wrong with the air. It felt thick, heavy, and the faint smell of something rotten lingered in the back of my throat. I stepped inside, my flashlight flicking over the shelves, the dusty floor. Then I saw it. A smear of something dark, sticky, and thick ran along the wall. It looked like blood or something worse. I felt the bile rise in my throat, and I quickly backed away, my heart racing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figure, standing at the far corner of the room, as though it had been waiting for me to look. Its outline was clearer now, its tall, slender form towering over everything in the room. It was more real than ever before, the air around it shivering with something dark, something alive. The figure didn't move. It just stared, its face still hidden in shadow. I didn't wait. I turned on my heel and bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. My feet pounded against the floor, the thumping of my own body the only sound I could hear. But as I reached the hallway, I stopped. The doors were all locked. The exit, I couldn't reach it. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut, the glass too thick to break through. I was trapped. And that's when I saw it. The figure had followed me. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was right behind me, its cold, shadowy presence pressing in from every side. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, unable to tear my eyes away from it. It moved closer, slower this time, deliberate, as though savoring every moment. I realized then that I wasn't going to leave. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something I could run from. I had been chosen, or cursed, or maybe it didn't matter. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the tapping. Fainter now, but still there. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was outside. Somehow, I had found my way to the parking lot, but I had no memory of how I got there. My hands were shaking, my body cold and stiff. I didn't understand what had happened. All I knew was that the building behind me silent and still felt wrong. I never went back. It's been weeks since that night, and yet I can't shake the feeling that it's still with me. Some nights, when the air is thick with silence and the shadows grow long, I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the corners of the room as though expecting the thing to step out from the darkness once again. But it doesn't. The building is gone now. It's been boarded up, condemned. The city decided it was too dangerous to stand. Too much had happened. Too many accidents, strange reports, and unexplained disappearances. But that doesn't explain everything. There's still a part of me that believes the truth was hidden, that the answers I never got were buried beneath the layers of dust and secrecy that surrounded that place. I've tried to move on, to live my life again, to find peace. But how can you find peace when the fear lingers? It's not the fear of the figure I saw. No, that part awful as it was fades with time. The real fear comes from the unknown. It's the unanswered questions, the things I will never know. What was that thing? Why was it following me? Why did it choose me? I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? Watching? Waiting? There are nights when I can feel it, lurking in the corners of my mind, like a shadow that refuses to leave. It's not a physical presence anymore, but a feeling, a sensation, and it's all too real. You'd think that after everything, I would have a clear picture of what happened that night, that I'd be able to explain it, rationalize it. But the truth is, I don't know what it was. I don't know what I saw, what I felt. Maybe I never will. The truth is, I'm not sure if I even want to know. Some people have told me I should seek help. Therapy, they say. Talk about it, get it out. But how can you talk about something so incomprehensible? How do you explain to someone that what you saw wasn't just a hallucination or a trick of the mind? That it wasn't just stress or fear? I know what I saw. I felt it. I lived it. The worst part, I think, is the haunting realization that I wasn't just a random victim. That whatever it was, whatever he was, wasn't something that picked me by accident. I was chosen for a reason. I don't know what that reason is, but deep down, I know that I haven't escaped it. It hasn't gone away. Not really. Even as I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I hear it. The tapping. It's faint, but it's there. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to bring back the terror I experienced that night. Or maybe, just maybe, it's real. I've tried to ignore it. I've tried to tell myself that it's over. But then I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my vision, just out of reach. A shadow moving too quickly to fully register. I freeze. My heart races. But it's nothing. I tell myself it's nothing. The tapping grows louder in my mind, like a drumbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I hear it even when I'm alone, even when I'm in broad daylight. When I close my eyes, it echoes in the darkness, soft and rhythmic. The memory of it haunts me, like a constant companion that I can never escape. And I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, waiting for me? The night I left the building, I thought I was free. But I wasn't. I was just the beginning. And maybe that's the hardest thing to accept. The terror doesn't end. It's not something that disappears when the lights turn on. It's always there, lurking beneath the surface. We can hide from it, run from it, try to forget it. But we can never escape it. It stays with us in the corners of our minds, tapping softly, patiently, as it waits for the right moment to make itself known again. Maybe it's not over. Maybe it never will be. This story takes place in an office building that had seen better days. The kind of place where the hum of fluorescent lights was constant and the sharp scent of old coffee lingered in the air. It was a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the city. I was working my usual night shift there, alone, just like the dozens of others before. My job was simple: man the desk, handle calls, and make sure everything ran smoothly when the rest of the world was asleep. I'd been doing it for years, so the routine had become second nature to me. There was something strangely comforting about it, too, being in the building at night. The quiet, the stillness, the freedom to think without distractions. I didn't mind the hours. In fact, I preferred them. The office was on the 12th floor of a nondescript building that had been standing for decades. It was the type of place most people passed by without a second glance. You wouldn't find any cutting-edge technology or sleek, modern decor here. The desks were old, the carpet worn thin in places, and the walls had a strange yellowish way to them, like they had absorbed the years of cigarette smoke and late-night meetings. My station was by the window, offering a panoramic view of the empty city streets below. On a good night, I could see the lights of distant cars moving along the highway. But tonight, the city was silent, the streets barely moving. I wasn't bothered by the silence. In fact, it was a welcome break. At least during the night shift, I didn't have to deal with the hustle and bustle of the daytime crowd. No one was around to bother me. It was just me in the building, and I was perfectly content with that. The employees I worked with during the day were all nice enough, but I couldn't say I had any close friends in the office. There was a certain distance between us, as if we were all just passing through, waiting for the clock to strike 5 so we could go home. There was one manager I had spoken to a few times, but our conversations rarely went beyond work-related matters. Still, I couldn't say it was a bad environment, just one that was lacking. The building itself had a strange history. I'd heard rumors from some of the older employees about it. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it had been the site of strange occurrences over the years. I didn't pay much attention to any of that. After all, who believed in ghost stories these days? But there was one thing I did notice. The place felt different at night. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but there was something off about it. It was as if the walls held secrets that no one cared to reveal. I had no real reason to believe those rumors, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little curious. On this particular night, everything started like it always did. The clock struck midnight, and I settled into my chair, pulling my laptop closer and beginning my usual routine. The only sounds in the room were the faint clicking of the keys and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I was used to the quiet, but tonight there was something different in the air. Something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way the building seemed to groan under its own weight, or how the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. At first, I brushed it off. It was just my imagination, I thought. But as the night wore on, things started to feel strange. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me, maybe. I shrugged it off and focused on the work at hand. I didn't have time for distractions. But as I glanced up at the clock, I saw the time was slowly crawling by, and I felt the minutes stretch into hours. I had been in this building countless times before, yet tonight it felt as if something was watching. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. Something was there with me, but I couldn't say what. Now I had to keep going. The night shift was long, and I was determined to push through it. After all, I was just another employee doing his job. That's all. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling, a voice in my head that whispered that something was about to change. Something was about to happen. I couldn't shake it. Just as I tried to focus again on my laptop, a strange sound echoed from down the hall. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but then it came again, louder this time. A faint tapping noise, almost like someone was walking, but the sound was off, like it didn't belong. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I strained to listen. The tapping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. I sat still, not sure what to make of it. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was nothing. Just some noise from the old building settling. It wasn't unusual for a building to make strange noises at night, right? Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance around the empty office. There was no one else there. I was alone. But something told me that wasn't entirely true. Something, or someone, was there with me. The first sound I heard seemed almost too soft to be real, barely a tap. Really, but enough to make me pause. At first, I attributed it to the building itself, a creak from the old floorboards, or maybe the pipes groaning under pressure. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I'd been working late in this office for years, and I'd never heard anything like it. It wasn't a thud or a knock, it was a tap. Clear, precise, almost deliberate. I sat up straighter in my chair, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. The quiet was thick, hanging in the air like a blanket. I looked around the room, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing. The office was exactly as it had been for the past hour. Empty, silent, and still. But then came another tap. Louder this time. It came from the hallway, down the corridor that led to the break room and the restrooms. The sound was so faint, so subtle, that I almost dismissed it as just my imagination. Yet, my instinct told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I leaned back in my chair and strained to listen. The sound had stopped, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning and the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just fatigue messing with me. It had been a long shift, and I hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. Maybe I was just hearing things. Still, a gnawing unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. The noise had felt too purposeful to ignore. I told myself to get back to work. The reports weren't going to finish themselves. But my focus was broken now. My thoughts kept drifting back to that faint tapping, like a distant rhythm that my mind couldn't quite escape. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:15 a.m., the dead of night. The office building was almost always quiet at this hour, but tonight it felt different, almost as if the building itself was awake. I didn't want to be one of those people who let their imaginations run wild. But this wasn't the first time I'd felt this way. There was something unnerving about this building at night. A presence. It was an uncomfortable sensation, like a weight pressing down on my chest, and I couldn't shake it. My eyes flickered to the hallway again, where the noise had come from. The corridor was bathed in shadows, with only the dim light from the far end casting long, distorted shapes across the floor. My gaze lingered on the darkness, willing myself to see something, anything that would explain the sound. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. I needed to focus. I needed to finish the work. The tapping, I decided, had to have been something mundane. A loose pipe, the air ducts, maybe a janitor walking around on the other side of the building. I took a deep breath, reminding myself how many nights I'd spent in this very office without incident. It was just the building settling, I told myself. But then, as if to prove me wrong, it came again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct sounds, each one clearer than the last. This time, the tapping didn't stop. It continued, growing in intensity, moving down the hallway, almost like it was approaching. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it now. The tapping was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. And it was getting closer. I wasn't sure what compelled me to stand up from my desk, but I did. Slowly, cautiously. Every step felt like a decision I couldn't undo. My legs felt heavy as I moved toward the hallway, my eyes scanning the dark space ahead of me. The tapping had stopped, but I could still hear a faint sound, a shuffle of footsteps, almost inaudible, but undeniably present. I couldn't see anything. Nothing was out of place. But I wasn't stupid. I knew something was off. I reached the doorway of the hallway and hesitated. The dim light at the end of the corridor did little to reveal what was beyond. The sound was gone now, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The air in the hallway felt different, thicker, heavier. I swallowed hard and stepped into the darkness. I walked down the hall, my steps slow, deliberate. I glanced at the door to the break room, nothing. The restrooms empty. I continued past the filing cabinets and the long rows of desks, each one bathed in shadows, each one a reminder that I was the only person in the building. But even with all the lights on, there was something that made it feel off, unsettling. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it again. The faintest sound. A breath, a rustling noise. Almost like someone was there. But there was no one. I turned around and hurried back toward my desk, my heart racing now. I didn't know what I had expected to find, but I was certain I hadn't found it. There was nothing. No one. The hallway was empty. The office was empty. And yet, I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I sat back down at my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on my work again. But the tapping was still in my mind. The shuffle of footsteps, the breath, the strange sense that I wasn't truly alone in the office. I told myself to be rational. There had to be a logical explanation. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized I wasn't convinced. I glanced around the office once more, my eyes settling on the hallway. No taps, no steps, just silence. But the silence felt heavy now, oppressive. I tried to push it aside and focus on my screen. But as I did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chair in the break room was slightly turned. No one had been there. I was sure of it. The office was empty when I walked down the hall. But now, that chair usually pushed up against the desk was turned at an odd angle. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing. The feeling of being watched, the odd sounds, the subtle disturbances. It was all starting to feel too real, too close. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. But the chair wasn't supposed to be like that. The following night, the office felt different, more oppressive. As I arrived for my shift, the usual sense of routine, locking the door, flipping the switch to turn on the lights, and settling into my desk felt like a ritual of resignation rather than the comfort it usually brought. I couldn't shake the events from the previous evening. That sound, that sensation of being watched, the coldness of the air that seemed to cling to my skin like a whisper. It was all so vivid in my mind, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. I sat down at my desk, the flickering fluorescent lights above me adding to the discomfort. Every time the hum of the lights fluctuated, my eyes darted toward the shadows in the corners of the office. The night had a way of turning the mundane into something sinister. As I began to sort through the files, I found myself glancing up at the clock every few minutes. It was 8:10 p.m. It felt too early for the world outside to be this quiet. Then the tapping started again. But this time, it was different. It was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It seemed to echo through the walls themselves, as though it was coming from every direction. The rhythmic sound seemed to bounce off the walls and reverberate through the air, an unsettling chorus that left my teeth on edge. I froze. It wasn't just a tap here and there anymore. It was constant, persistent. Every few seconds, the tap would come. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the office remained still too still. The hum of the lights, the whir of the AC, and the tapping were the only sounds. I knew I couldn't ignore it. Not this time. With a deep breath, I pushed my chair back and stood up, my legs trembling slightly as I walked toward the hallway again. The lights flickered once more, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor, distorting the hallway into something almost unrecognizable. My eyes scanned the area, but everything was the same. The dark stretch of empty offices, the lonely desks, and the stark white walls. The tapping had stopped, but I wasn't convinced. I checked the break room first. The chair I'd noticed the night before was still turned at an odd angle, not quite facing the desk, but not facing away from it either. It was as if it had been carefully placed that way. I reached out and pushed it back into place, the cold metal legs scraping across the floor, a sound that grated against my nerves. Then I moved toward the restrooms, the air around me thickening with every step. The silence of the building was deafening, the sound of my shoes clicking on the tile floor, a stark contrast to the eerie quiet that surrounded me. I pushed open the door to the men's room, my breath catching in my throat when I saw that the light above the mirror was flickering. It wasn't the soft, rhythmic flicker of a dying bulb. It was erratic, stuttering as though the electrical current was being interrupted. My heart raced in my chest as I walked past the sink, the air in the room suddenly growing colder. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't help but glance at the mirror. There was nothing there, of course, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I left the restrooms and moved back toward the hallway, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that clung to me. The tapping had stopped again, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I could almost feel the weight of something pressing down on me, something unseen yet undeniably present. When I turned back toward my desk, my eyes landed on the file I'd been working on. It was open, the papers scattered across the desk, though I was certain I had left them neatly stacked earlier. Something wasn't right. My breath hitched in my throat as I approached, my hand hovering over the papers. I reached out and pulled them together, the rustling sound of the pages louder than it should have been. I could feel the eyes of the office on me. Then came a louder noise, a crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as I searched for the source. The noise had come from the back of the office, near the supply closet. My pulse quickened, my feet carrying me down the hallway once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. The lights above me flickered again, casting the corridor in an intermittent, dizzying strobe effect. As I rounded the corner, my eyes darted toward the supply closet door. It was ajar, the dark interior beyond impossible to see. I took a step forward, then another, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I pulled it open, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. The closet was empty. No broken glass. No overturned shelves. Just the same stacks of paper and boxes of supplies. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I was beginning to question my own sanity. Could I be imagining these things? Could the stress of the long hours be getting to me? I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark corner of the closet, waiting for anything to move. But the silence was deafening. As I closed the closet door, I felt a rush of cold air sweep over me, so sudden and intense that it made me stagger back. I shivered, rubbing my arms, trying to ignore the unease that had settled deep in my bones. There was no draft. The air conditioning was still running at its usual temperature, yet I could feel the cold, as if something had brushed past me, something unseen but present. That's when I heard it again, the sound of shuffling footsteps. They were closer this time, unmistakable and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but once again there was nothing. No one. Just the empty office, the shadows stretching long across the walls, and the hum of the lights. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued, now pacing back and forth, just beyond the hallway corner. Step after step, slow and measured, as though whoever was walking didn't care whether I heard them or not. I moved back toward my desk, my every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, as if the very building was holding me in place. The office was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me as the tapping started once more, this time from the floor above. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was no longer just a sound. It was a signal, a warning. The building was alive, and I was the only one who could hear it. The air around me grew thick with a strange tension, and I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't alone in this office anymore. Something was here with me, and it was getting closer. By the time midnight rolled around, my mind was spiraling. The events of the last few nights had begun to unravel my sense of reality. I was exhausted mentally and physically, but the exhaustion only seemed to fuel my paranoia. The ticking clock, the tap-tap-tap echoing in the walls, the footsteps that never seemed to have a source, the cold air that gripped my skin. It was all becoming too much to bear. It felt as if the office itself had become a trap, a maze of empty spaces and shadows that watched my every move. I had to get out, but I couldn't leave. I had tried to convince myself that maybe I was just losing it, that the isolation, the late hours, and the creeping monotony of my job were finally taking their toll. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something else was going on here, something real. And it was coming for me. The sounds had escalated in the last few minutes. The tapping, once faint and sporadic, had grown louder, more intense. Now it was a steady, unyielding rhythm, as if someone was moving within the walls. I stood up, trembling, my hands slick with sweat as I made my way toward the hallway once more. The lights flickered once more, casting harsh shadows that danced around me like twisted figures. With every step I took, the floor creaked beneath me, and the walls seemed to press closer, like the building was alive and watching. I paused, scanning the hallway. The door to the break room was slightly ajar, the faint glow of light leaking out from the gap. I hadn't left it like that. I approached cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. When I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning as if they were protesting my intrusion. The room was empty, just as it should be. But something was wrong. The chair in the far corner, the one I had carefully arranged just hours earlier, was now facing the other way. It wasn't just turned a little to the side. It was completely reversed. I couldn't even remember moving it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stepped closer. It was as if someone had been sitting in it recently, someone who had been watching me. Suddenly, there was a sound. A scraping noise, soft at first, then growing louder. It was coming from the far corner of the room, just beyond the table. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, drawn to it like a magnet. I turned the corner. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The table was covered in a mess of papers, files, and pens just like before. But there, in the center of the chaos, was a single piece of paper. It was folded in half, the creases sharp and deliberate. It looked like someone had placed it there with care. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped closer and picked up the paper. I unfolded it slowly, my hands shaking as I looked down at the words written in jagged, uneven handwriting. I'm still here. I dropped the paper as though it had burned me. The words seemed to burn into my mind, the message clear and chilling. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was in this building with me. It had been watching me the whole time. I backed away from the table, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting to see something, anything. I turned to run, but a sharp sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a loud crash, followed by a scraping noise, like something heavy had been dragged across the floor. I turned toward the sound and froze. The chair, the same chair I had just noticed, was now in the middle of the room. It had been dragged across the floor, the legs scraping loudly against the tile. I stood frozen, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the air in the room grew cold. It was so cold that I could see my breath, small clouds of vapor escaping my lips as I exhaled. I turned toward the door, but it was already closing, slowly, on its own. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. I turned back to the chair. It was still there, facing me now. And as I looked at it, I saw something, or rather, someone in it. A shadow, a figure, standing just behind the chair, its form dark and indistinct. Its presence sent a wave of icy terror crashing over me. I couldn't see its face if it had one, but I could feel it. The weight of its gaze was like a pressure on my chest, suffocating and unrelenting. And then, in a voice so faint it was almost a whisper, I heard it. "Leave. Now." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. The door flung open with a force I didn't know I had, and I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty office. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the elevator. I slammed my hand against the button, praying that it would come quickly. But as I waited, I heard it again, the tapping. Louder now, as if it was chasing me, echoing in the walls, growing faster, more insistent. The elevator doors opened just as I heard the first footstep behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone or something following me. I stumbled inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I looked up, catching a glimpse of the hallway one last time. The office was silent, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. As the elevator descended, the air inside it felt thick with tension. It was as though the building was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave, for me to make it out. I had barely made it through the doors when I heard it one last time. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. There was no one left to follow me. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, releasing me into the dimly lit lobby. My legs were shaky, as if they were no longer mine to control, and the air felt thick, as though I were breathing through cotton. I wanted to believe that it was over, that I was finally free. But the image of that shadow, standing behind the chair, watching me with its empty gaze, clung to my mind. I couldn't escape it. I stumbled through the lobby, barely noticing the exit doors in front of me. I pushed them open, and the cold night air hit my face like a slap. It was a relief, yet the sensation didn't bring comfort. It was more of a numbness, a hollow emptiness, as though the terror hadn't ended, but merely paused. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Should I go back inside and confront whatever I'd seen? I could still hear the echo of footsteps in my mind, feel the cold press of the unseen entity lurking in the office. But what could I even say to anyone? What explanation would make sense? The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't go back. Not tonight. Not after what I had witnessed. I walked slowly to my car, the headlights flickering as I approached. I unlocked the door with a trembling hand and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life as I shoved the key in, my mind racing. I had to get away. I had to leave it all behind. As I drove, my thoughts tangled and collided. Had anyone else noticed anything strange? Were the others who worked in that building safe? What was that thing in the shadows? My mind struggled to make sense of it, but every thought was clouded by fear. The worst part was that I knew I'd never find answers. The events that had unfolded over the past few days had been unexplainable, supernatural, beyond the realms of anything I could comprehend. And then it hit me, the truth I had been avoiding all along. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Whatever had happened that night, whatever had stalked me through the office, had been building for weeks. I wasn't the first to experience it. I wasn't the first to feel the cold, hear the footsteps, see the shadows moving. The office had always been there, but now it felt different. Now, I understood the reality of what had been happening for far too long. The problem was, I had no idea how to fix it. I had no idea what I had even been up against. Was it a ghost? A demon? Something else entirely? The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't let it go. It would follow me wherever I went, a shadow haunting me forever. The drive home felt like it took forever, but I was still trapped in my mind. What could I do now? Should I tell someone? Should I warn the others at the office? What if I was the only one who could feel it? What if no one else believed me? I pulled into my driveway, and the familiar sight of home did nothing to calm the storm inside me. The house was dark, silent. I parked the car, but I didn't move to get out. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. My breath was still shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. Even though I was miles away from the office, I could still feel it. The presence, the cold, the weight of something waiting just behind me. Finally, I took a deep breath, forced myself to step out of the car, and walked into the house. The door creaked shut behind me, and for a moment, I felt as though I was safe. But I knew deep down that there was no escaping what had followed me from that building. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. The sounds, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, it was all still there, lingering in the background, like a phantom presence. I didn't sleep, didn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure in the chair. I felt the cold air wrap around me like a vice. I couldn't go back to work. I couldn't face that place again. I didn't know if I could ever step foot inside that office building again without the fear choking me. But I wasn't alone in my misery. I reached out to a colleague, someone I trusted, someone who had worked with me for years. I needed to know if they'd experienced anything strange. I needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. When I called, I could tell from the tone of their voice that they hadn't been sleeping either. They were nervous, anxious. I didn't waste any time. I asked if they'd heard anything strange recently, anything unsettling that couldn't be explained. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then the voice on the phone spoke, barely above a whisper. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I nodded even though they couldn't see me. "What is it? What's happening in that building?" "I don't know, but I've been hearing things, seeing things, just like you. But I can't tell anyone. People would think we're crazy." The conversation ended shortly after that, but it was enough. Enough to make me realize that whatever was happening, I wasn't the only one. I wasn't the only one haunted by the darkness that had been lurking in that office building. But the more I thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Who or what was this entity? Why had it chosen that building? Was there something in the office, something hidden beneath the surface, that had awakened its presence? I never found the answers to those questions. And to this day, I don't know if I ever will. The weeks passed, and I made the decision to leave my job. It wasn't just the fear, it was the uncertainty, the unease that clung to every corner of that place. I moved on, found a new job, started fresh. I still think about what happened, about the cold presence that followed me, about the shadow in the chair. But I don't go back there. I don't think I ever will. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside or the night grows too still, I can feel it again, the presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. But I've learned to ignore it, because I know, deep down, that there are some things in this world that can't be explained, no matter how hard you try. Some things are just meant to be left alone. The decision to leave my old job wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With each passing day, I felt the weight of that building's darkness lift from my shoulders, but it wasn't gone. It would never be gone. There are some things that haunt you, not just for days, weeks, or even months, but for a lifetime. Some experiences don't fade. They become part of who you are. woven into the fabric of your mind, always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It's been years since I've worked at that office. I've moved to a new city, taken on a new role, and rebuilt my life, piece by piece. On the surface, everything looks normal. People ask how I'm doing, and I smile and tell them I'm fine, because that's what people expect to hear. But inside, I'm not the same. The person I was before that night, the one who could walk into any office without a second thought, no longer exists. I don't think about it every day. The memories of that office, the unsettling noises, the strange occurrences, they come to me in fleeting moments, unexpected flashes that make my heart race. A door closing behind me, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a chill in the air on a warm day. The world feels different when you've experienced something like that, something that can't be explained, something that rattles the very core of your reality. It wasn't just the terrifying events that changed me. It was the uncertainty, the feeling that no matter how far I ran, the darkness would follow. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I knew that much, but I also knew that it wasn't something that could be shared with anyone who hadn't been there. It's one of those things that you carry with you, a burden that doesn't lighten no matter how much time passes. I've tried to move on, tried to forget the building, the things that happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it, the cold air, the presence, the eerie sense of being watched. It's not always overwhelming, but it's there. I know it is, and I can't escape it. The worst part is, I'm not sure what it was that haunted that office. Was it a ghost? A demon? Or something else entirely? Something older, darker? I don't know. I never found out, and part of me isn't sure I want to. Some things are better left unanswered, and some mysteries, I've learned, are better left alone. I've learned to live with it, to ignore the odd sensations and fleeting thoughts that occasionally surface. I keep myself busy, focusing on my new job, my new life, and the people I care about. I've even tried to put it all behind me, telling myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind after too many long hours in an empty office. But deep down, I know the truth. It was real. What happened there was real. And I'm not the only one who knows it. As I sit here, writing this, I can feel that same chill in the air, the same unease that used to settle over me in the office. Maybe it's the time of night, or maybe it's something deeper, something beyond my understanding. But I can't shake the feeling that I haven't truly escaped. The shadows that haunted me then are still with me, even now. Maybe it's the way the world works. Sometimes things happen that we can't explain, and they leave a mark on us. Maybe there are things in this world that are just beyond our comprehension, things that we can't control or understand. I don't know, but I do know this. There are nights when I can't sleep, when the air grows heavy, and the shadows seem to stretch just a little too far. And in those moments, I wonder if the darkness I thought I had left behind is really still there, waiting. Maybe that's the most unsettling thing of all, that I'll never know, that I'll never have the answers I'm looking for. Some questions are never meant to be answered, and some truths are too terrifying to confront. And so, I live with the knowledge that whatever it was that haunted me in that office still lingers in the corners of my mind, just out of reach. And no matter how hard I try to escape, no matter how far I go, it will always be there, waiting for the next time I'm foolish enough to remember. The shadows never truly leave. They simply wait. And so, the story ends, but the feeling remains forever in the back of my mind. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the thing that happens, it's the thing that doesn't. The questions that are left unanswered, the fear that lingers in the air, the way something can haunt you even when you think you've moved on. That is the true terror of the unknown. And no matter how far you run, it will always catch up with you. The first time I heard about the job, it sounded simple enough. I work as a delivery driver, and most of my routes are uneventful. It's the usual routine: pick up, drop off, and try to stay on schedule. I've been at it for a few years now, and I'm used to long hours behind the wheel, the hum of the engine keeping me company as I navigate roads that range from bustling highways to narrow, winding backstreets. That day started out just like any other. I woke up before the sun, as usual, and grabbed a quick breakfast coffee black, toast slightly burnt, and an apple I never quite finished. My phone buzzed with the day's assignments, and one in particular caught my eye. It wasn't the destination itself that stood out. I had delivered to rural areas plenty of times. It was the instructions. The address wasn't on any map, and the directions included landmarks that sounded oddly specific. Past the broken windmill, take the unmarked dirt road on the left, and continue until you reach a house with a red door. The note ended with a warning: deliver after dark. At first, I brushed it off. People have their quirks, and I've seen stranger things. Still, something about that note lingered in my mind as I loaded my van. The package wasn't unusual, just a plain cardboard box, sealed tightly with tape and marked fragile. No return address, just the recipient's name, D. Hill, scribbled in black ink. By the time the sun started setting, I was well into my route. The last delivery on my list was the one with the unusual instructions, and I'll admit I was curious. Driving through the city, surrounded by the usual chaos of honking cars and flashing billboards, it was easy to dismiss any unease. But as I left the urban sprawl behind and entered the countryside, the world grew quieter. The hum of the engine felt louder in the stillness, and the glow of my headlights carved a narrow path through the dark. I passed the landmarks as described. First, the broken windmill, its blades creaking faintly in the night breeze. Then, the unmarked dirt road, barely visible in the dim light. Turning onto it, the gravel crunched beneath my tires, and trees loomed on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air felt different here, heavier, somehow. I rolled down the window to let in some fresh air, but the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic only added to the strange atmosphere. Checking the directions again, I reminded myself that this was just another delivery. Nothing more. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the house in the distance. A single-story structure with peeling paint and a bright red door. The windows were dark, and there were no signs of life. I parked the van a few feet away and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The night was silent except for the distant hoot of an owl. I carried the package to the door, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. Knocking lightly, I waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I glanced back at the van, debating whether to leave the package on the porch. But the note had been clear: deliver after dark. There was no mention of what to do if no one answered. Standing there in the quiet, with the cool night air prickling my skin, I felt a strange unease. My usual delivery routes were predictable, almost comforting in their monotony. This was different. The house seemed to stare back at me, its dark windows like hollow eyes. As the seconds stretched on, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down. Something about this place wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Taking a deep breath, I knocked one last time. This time, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, almost like shuffling, coming from inside. I leaned in slightly, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it started. That was when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the base of the door, just at the edge of the porch light's glow, there was a small smear of red. It could have been paint, maybe from the door itself, but something about it looked off. It was darker, thicker, almost fresh. I straightened up quickly, glancing around. The night was still quiet, but the stillness felt charged, as if the very air was holding its breath. My instincts told me to leave, to drop the package and go. But the job wasn't done yet. As I stood there on the porch, clutching the package, I debated my next move. The smear of red near the base of the door kept drawing my eyes, and the longer I looked at it, the less it resembled paint. It didn't drip like fresh blood might, but it had a tacky, almost congealed texture. My gut told me to turn back, but the professional in me, the guy who prided himself on completing every delivery, won out. I knocked again, this time with a bit more force. The sound echoed dully through the house, but no one answered. After a moment, I leaned forward and called out, "Hello? I've got a delivery for D. Hill. Is anyone home?" The silence was oppressive. Even the distant hoot of the owl I'd heard earlier was gone. My voice felt swallowed by the night, and as I stood there waiting, a cold wind crept up the back of my neck. I placed the package carefully on the porch, deciding to take a picture as proof of delivery. It was standard procedure for these kinds of jobs, especially with rural drops. Pulling out my phone, I aimed the camera at the box and clicked. But when I glanced at the screen, something froze me in place. There was a shadow in the corner of the frame, a tall, indistinct figure standing just inside the window to the left of the door. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen anyone when I first walked up, and I was sure no one had opened the door while I'd been knocking. The figure was motionless, just a vague silhouette against the dim interior light. I lowered the phone and looked directly at the window. Nothing. The glass was dark, reflecting only the faint glow of my van's headlights. I glanced back at the photo, but the figure was still there, looming like it had been watching me. My first thought was that my eyes were playing tricks on me, or maybe it was a smudge on the glass, catching the light at just the right angle. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My hands felt clammy as I tucked my phone back into my pocket. "Hello?" I called again, my voice a little less steady this time. "If you're there, I just need a signature for the delivery." No response. A minute passed, then another. I could feel my nerves fraying, each second stretching out longer than the last. That's when I heard a soft, deliberate tap 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 coming from behind the door. It wasn't a knock, exactly. It was lighter, more rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. My pulse quickened. I stepped back instinctively, almost stumbling off the porch. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound firm, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, I thought about leaving, just getting in the van and driving back to the city. But something rooted me to the spot: curiosity, fear, or maybe just the bizarre sense of obligation to see this through. Gathering what little courage I had, I moved closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. The wood felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been left out in freezing weather. For a few seconds, there was nothing but quiet. Then I heard it again. Not tapping this time, but faint breathing. It was shallow and irregular, like someone struggling to catch their breath. My heart hammered in my chest. I stepped back, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "All right, I'm leaving this here," I said loudly, trying to mask my growing unease. "If you don't come out, I'll mark it as delivered." I placed the package on the ground and took several steps backward, my eyes fixed on the door. My van was only a few feet away, but it felt like a mile. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to get out of there. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it again. Not tapping or breathing this time, but the sound of a phone ringing. The sound was muffled, like it was coming from inside the house. It was an old-fashioned ringtone, the kind you don't hear much anymore, a shrill, repetitive chime. I froze, listening. The phone rang twice, then stopped. I waited, half expecting someone to answer, but no voice came. The silence returned, heavier than before. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration startled me so badly I nearly dropped it. Pulling it out with shaking hands, I saw an unknown number on the screen. The area code wasn't one I recognized, but it matched the region I was in. For a moment, I debated answering. Maybe it was the homeowner trying to reach me. I swiped to answer. "Hello?" There was no response, just static. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time. The static crackled, and then I heard it, the same shallow breathing I'd heard through the door. My stomach lurched. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. The breathing continued for a few seconds, and then the line went dead. That was it for me. I turned and practically ran to the van, my boots slipping on the loose gravel. Climbing into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, dark and unassuming, the red door stark against the shadowy backdrop. But just before I turned onto the main road, I saw something or someone standing in the window. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a figure, pale and motionless, watching me as I drove away. The drive back to the city was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even though the road behind me was empty. When I finally pulled into the depot, my boss was waiting for me. "You're late," he said, his tone more annoyed than concerned. I didn't explain. What could I say? That I'd been spooked by a shadow, a phone call, and some strange noises. He wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the events in my mind. The tapping, the breathing, the shadow in the window, it all felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But the worst part was the photo. When I finally worked up the nerve to check my phone, I found the picture I'd taken on the porch. The shadow was still there, but now it was clearer. It wasn't just a vague shape, it was a face, and it was staring directly at me. The following days were a blur of confusion and dread. It wasn't just the unsettling experience at the Hill House that lingered in my mind. It was the feeling that something wasn't right, something beyond a simple delivery mishap. I tried to go back to my usual routine, but it was hard to shake the image of that face in the window, haunting me at every turn. It started small, almost like a trick of the mind. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, the sense that I wasn't alone in the room overwhelming me. I'd turn on the bedside lamp and glance around, convinced I'd see something in the shadows, but there was nothing. After a few nights of this, I chalked it up to the stress of the job. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But then the phone call started. It was always the same. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside felt still, my phone would ring with an unknown number, and each time I answered, all I heard was that same shallow breathing, the rasping inhalations that made my skin crawl. Each call lasted no more than a few seconds, but it was enough to unsettle me to the core. I tried blocking the number, but it didn't stop. The calls kept coming, and with each one, the breathing seemed to get louder, more desperate. One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my jacket, threw it over my shoulders, and made my way to the kitchen. The house was unnaturally quiet. No hum of the refrigerator, no creak of the old wood floors settling under the weight of the house. It felt as if the world outside had stopped moving entirely. I stood in front of the window, staring out into the darkness. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the yard. My reflection in the glass seemed distorted, like a stranger staring back at me. The call had come again, just minutes earlier. My hands still trembled from the experience, but I had to know who or what was tormenting me. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and made my way to the front door. It was as if every step I took grew heavier, the air thicker, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had to keep moving, though. I had to find out what was going on, to make sense of the chaos in my head. I drove out to the Hill House again, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Part of me hoped that the strange feeling I'd had the first time would have dissipated with time, that it had been some figment of my imagination brought on by nerves. But as I pulled up the long driveway, my stomach churned. The house stood there in the darkness, just as I remembered it, only now it seemed more sinister. The red door was slightly ajar, just as it had been when I'd left it, though this time I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the van, the gravel crunching underfoot like a loud reminder that I wasn't alone. I had to know the truth. I approached the porch slowly, my breath coming out in short bursts. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, almost like rust, but I couldn't place it. It was only when I reached the door that I realized the source of the smell. It was coming from inside the house. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone home?" The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. There was no answer. The door creaked open, as though inviting me in. I hesitated. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, to leave before things escalated any further. but I couldn't. Something was pulling me inside. Stepping cautiously over the threshold, I was immediately hit by the cold. It wasn't just chilly, it was a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house was just as I remembered. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and an eerie stillness that made it feel as though it hadn't been touched in years. But as my light swept across the room, I noticed something new. There was a stain on the floor, dark, like spilled ink or oil. It spread out in an irregular pattern, growing larger the further I walked into the house. My heart raced. I hadn't seen this before, and it wasn't just some random spill. It looked deliberate, like something or someone had been dragged across the floor. I moved closer, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around me. My flashlight flickered once, twice, before it died completely. I cursed under my breath and pulled out my phone. As I clicked the flashlight app, the screen flashed once and went black. That's when I heard a faint sound like the soft rustling of paper coming from upstairs. It was slow at first, then became louder, almost rhythmic, like someone was pacing back and forth. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the staircase, my pulse racing in my ears. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air up here was even colder, the oppressive silence almost unbearable. The rustling sound was clearer now, closer, and I could tell it was coming from the room at the end of the hall. As I reached the door, I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But my feet were already moving, carrying me toward the door that seemed to beckon me with an invisible force. I reached for the handle and twisted. The door opened with a loud groan, revealing a room that was completely empty, except for the mirror. It was old, framed in tarnished silver, its surface cracked in places. But as I stepped into the room, I felt something strange. The air was thick here, heavy with something I couldn't describe. The rustling sound had stopped, but I could feel it, the presence of something in the room with me, just beyond the reach of my senses. And that's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. At first, it was just a shadow, but as my gaze fixed on the glass, it became clearer, two eyes, hollow and dark, staring back at me. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it were studying me, waiting for something. And then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped even further. My breath came out in visible clouds, and the sound of my racing heartbeat filled my ears. I turned to leave, but when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The room was empty once more. I didn't waste another second. I ran down the stairs, barely taking the steps two at a time. My heart felt like it was going to burst, my legs trembling beneath me. I reached the front door and burst outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop running until I was back in my van, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the steering wheel. The house was behind me, but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. It was the worst kind of silence, an eerie stillness that weighed on my chest as I sat in the van, staring at the hill house in the rearview mirror. The night had settled into a suffocating embrace, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, waiting for my next move. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I tried to force my mind into rationality, but nothing made sense anymore. What had I really seen in the mirror? What was it that I had felt in that room? I could still hear the faint rustling, as if it was echoing in my mind. And those eyes, the hollow, empty eyes that had stared back at me from the shattered mirror, wouldn't leave me. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it had been some trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination, I knew deep down that something was wrong. Something dark and terrible had taken root in that house, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I needed answers. I parked a few houses down from the hill house and sat there for a moment, collecting myself. The adrenaline from my escape had worn off, replaced by a bone-deep fear that I couldn't ignore. I had to go back. I had to know what was really going on. I had told myself I would never return to that house, that I had seen enough. But there was no denying the pull of curiosity, the need to understand what had happened to me. After a few long breaths, I opened the door and stepped out of the van, the cold air biting at my face. My body felt heavy with dread as I walked back toward the house. The porch light flickered like a warning, but I ignored it. The closer I got, the more I could feel the weight of something invisible pressing down on me. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing with a malevolent presence that seeped into the very air I was breathing. I stood in front of the door again, my heart racing in my chest, but this time there was no hesitation. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open with a disturbing slowness, as though the house itself was reluctant to let me inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air was thicker than before, colder, as though the very atmosphere had shifted to something darker. I knew I was no longer alone. There was something here with me. I moved through the house cautiously, each step deliberate but uncertain. The faint smell of rust still hung in the air, and the darkness seemed to wrap around me, swallowing every sound. My flashlight flickered in and out of focus, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as the silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't the same silence I had encountered before. It was heavier, more oppressive. I made my way upstairs again, my breath shallow, my mind racing with questions. Was I going mad? Was I imagining all of this? But with every step, the fear intensified. It was as though the house was pulling me in, guiding me towards something I couldn't understand. I reached the door of the room where I had seen the mirror, and before I could even think, I pushed it open. The room was empty, or so it seemed. But the mirror, it was different. This time, it wasn't cracked. It was intact, its surface gleaming in the faint light from my flashlight. But it wasn't the reflection that startled me. It was the fact that there was someone standing in front of it, a figure. A woman, her back to me, her long hair cascading over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. I froze, unable to move or speak. The woman didn't turn around. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. But I could feel her. I could feel her energy, her power, radiating from her like heat from an open flame. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. What? What do you want from me? My voice cracked, but the woman didn't respond. She just stood there, staring into the mirror. I stepped forward, barely able to breathe, my eyes locked on her back. There was something about her that I couldn't place, something hauntingly familiar. And then, as I watched, the woman turned slowly. Her face, it wasn't human. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black, empty, soulless pits of darkness. Her lips were stretched into a wide, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. I staggered back in shock, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Why are you here? The words left my mouth in a whisper, but they felt wrong. They felt like they weren't my own. The woman didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just raised a hand, pointing at me with a long, bony finger. As she did, I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and suddenly I was standing in front of the mirror, looking into my own reflection. But it wasn't me. It was the woman's face staring back at me, her eyes black and empty, her smile twisted and sinister. I stumbled backward, tripping over the floorboards and crashing to the ground. My head slammed against the wooden floor, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror coursing through my veins. I looked up, and the woman was gone. But the mirror, it was still there. I could see her in the reflection now, standing behind me. She was closer than before, her breath cold against my neck, her hands reaching toward me. I could feel the weight of her presence, like 1,000 eyes boring into my soul. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. My mind raced. What was happening? What was this place? And who was she? The woman's face contorted into a grotesque expression, her eyes now wide and filled with a malevolent hunger. You shouldn't have come here, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves scraping against the ground. The words echoed in my mind, and in that instant, I knew. I wasn't just trapped in the house anymore. I was trapped in a nightmare. Everything I thought I understood about reality was slipping away. The walls around me seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the air felt thick with malevolent intent. The woman moved toward me, her movements jerky and inhuman. I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from all around me, she spoke again. I was never meant to be found. I tried to run, to escape, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. I was trapped. Trapped with the woman. Trapped with whatever force had claimed this place. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I understood the truth. This wasn't just a house, it was a prison, and I was its newest inmate. I screamed, but no sound came out. My heart was pounding in my chest, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct told me to run, to find an escape from the terror that had consumed me, but the house was like a maze with no exit. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight, and the air felt thick with something unholy, a presence that seemed to cling to every corner of the room. I stumbled away from the mirror, my legs shaky beneath me, as I tried to regain control of my mind. I had to think there had to be a way out. The woman, the figure in the mirror, it had all felt so real. But was it? My thoughts were muddled, my mind struggling to differentiate between reality and the horrors that had been thrust upon me. I couldn't trust my own senses. The house was silent again. Too silent. I had to get out of here. The chilling whisper still echoed in my mind, a reminder of the woman's words. I was never meant to be found. The phrase clung to me, heavy and suffocating. What had she meant? Was she the ghost of someone who had lived here? Or was she something worse? Something far older than I could comprehend. I backed up against the wall, my breath ragged as my eyes darted around the room, searching for some sign of hope. My flashlight flickered again, the beam casting long shadows across the walls, making them seem like they were closing in on me. The longer I stood there, the more the house seemed to press in around me, each corner darker and more suffocating than the last. Then, a sound faint but unmistakable came from the hallway. It was like a low, distant creak, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The house had never been empty. It never would be. I strained my ears, listening for any clue about the direction of the sound, but the footsteps seemed to circle, moving closer, then farther away, as though they were teasing me. There was no escaping it. The house, the woman, everything, it was closing in on me, and I had no choice but to face it. But just as I steeled myself for whatever came next, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices. Soft, distant, like whispers carried on the winds. But these weren't the whispers I had heard before. These voices were clear, urgent, and familiar. Get out. You have to get out. I froze, the words cutting through the air like a knife. My body went cold, my thoughts racing. Who was that? Was I hearing things? The voices seemed to be coming from the room behind me, from the same space where I had seen the woman standing just moments ago. I turned around, my body moving on its own accord, drawn toward the sound. My feet carried me through the dark hallway, each step heavier than the last. The air felt dense, thick with an energy that pulsed and shifted around me. I felt a sense of urgency, as if time itself was running out. I reached the door to the room where the mirror stood, the one that had started it all. As I pushed it open, the voices grew louder. They weren't just whispers now, they were frantic, almost desperate. Please, leave now. It's not too late. The room was empty, but the mirror was different. It wasn't reflecting my image anymore. Instead, it was showing something else, something I couldn't comprehend. It was a scene, but not from the present. It was a memory. A haunting memory. A woman, her back to the camera, standing in front of a fire, her silhouette blurred by the flickering flames. Her face was hidden, but I knew it was her, the woman from before. The voices grew louder, more frantic. You have to stop it. It's too late for me, but not for you. You must break the curse. You must. The vision in the mirror shifted. The woman's face appeared pale, hollow-eyed, her smile stretched unnaturally wide. The smile was grotesque, but the worst part was her eyes. They weren't eyes at all. They were black, empty pits that seemed to pull me in, drawing me closer to the glass. I backed away, panic flooding my chest. The mirror, it was alive. The woman wasn't just a ghost. She was something trapped, something broken, and now she was trying to pull me into her world, into the nightmare she had been left in. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, and the air went cold. I could feel her presence behind me, the same cold that had plagued me since I first entered this place. The whispers started again, this time more forceful, like they were coming from all directions at once. Break the curse. You must break the curse. But how? How was I supposed to break something so ancient, so deeply ingrained in this house? What was the curse, and how had it bound her to this place? Then, as if the house itself had heard my thoughts, the walls began to tremble. The ground beneath me shook. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the house groaned and shifted around me. The mirrors, there were mirrors everywhere now. They appeared out of nowhere, lining the walls, reflecting my every movement, but there was something wrong with each reflection. They weren't just showing me, they were showing the woman, and her eyes, those dark, empty eyes, were staring back at me from every mirror. Break it! Break it! The voices echoed, their intensity rising with the shaking of the house. I didn't know how, but in that moment, I understood. The curse wasn't just about the house. It was about the mirrors. She had been trapped in them, pulled into them by some dark force that had bound her soul to the glass. And now, she was trying to pull me in, to make me just like her. A trapped soul, forever bound to this place. There was only one way out. I had to destroy the mirrors. I had to break the curse. With all the strength I had left, I stood up and began smashing the mirrors one by one. My hands bled, my body trembled, but I didn't stop. Each time the glass shattered, the house seemed to scream, the air growing colder, thicker. And with each crack, I felt the presence of the woman weaken, her power dissipating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last mirror fell to the ground with a deafening crash. The house stopped shaking. The whispers faded. The air returned to a strange, unnatural stillness. I was free. The curse was broken. But as I looked around the room, I realized something. There was no sign of the woman anymore. She had vanished. Had she been a figment of my imagination? Had I truly broken the curse, or had I merely made things worse? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I ever would. I left the house that night, my mind a blur of confusion and fear. The door opened easily this time, and as I stepped outside into the cold night air, I could feel the weight of the house lift off my shoulders. But the questions remained. What had happened in that house? Who was the woman? What had she wanted from me? I didn't know the answers, and part of me was relieved. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of the Hill House. And I wasn't sure I ever would. I had never truly believed in curses, in ghosts, in anything beyond the tangible reality I'd lived in for so long. But as I drove away from the Hill House, my heart still racing, my mind kept replaying every moment. The shattered mirrors, the whispers, the woman's eyes, those deep, hollow, black pits that I could still feel staring at me, even now. Even after everything I'd done to break free. The further I drove, the more the weight seemed to lift, the fog in my mind gradually clearing. By the time I reached the edge of the town, I thought I had left it all behind. I had escaped. The house, the curse, the woman, I thought they were gone for good. But I wasn't sure if I was free. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The headlights of the car behind me illuminated the empty road, a line of light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in the reflection. A shadow. A face. I blinked and looked again, but the mirror was empty. Was I imagining things? Or was it the house? Was it still there, watching me, waiting for me to return? I shuddered, gripping the steering wheel tighter as I focused on the road ahead. The last thing I wanted was to look back again. I had left that place. I had broken the curse. At least, that's what I told myself. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house hadn't let me go. I had left, yes, but the house and everything in it was still a part of me. The memories, the mirror's reflection, the woman's voice, they were burned into my mind, and no matter how far I drove, I knew they would never fully fade. My thoughts kept drifting back to that last moment in the house, when the last mirror shattered. I had felt the weight of something lift from my chest, a strange sense of release. But that was just the surface. Beneath it, there was a gnawing, unsettled feeling, something that couldn't be explained away. As the hours passed, the landscape outside my window began to change. The rural roads gave way to more familiar streets, and the small towns turned into the city lights that blurred past me. I pulled into the driveway of my apartment building, relieved to see the bright lights of the complex waiting for me. It was familiar. It was safe. But even as I walked up to my front door, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The apartment felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the silence inside was heavier, thicker. I turned on the lights, but the darkness lingered in the corners of the rooms. It was as if the shadows were watching me, waiting. I sat down on the couch, my thoughts racing. I had broken the mirrors. I had confronted the curse. So why did I feel like the nightmare was far from over? I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that it had all been a product of my exhaustion, of the stress of being trapped in that house for so long. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something else, something I couldn't explain. I turned on the TV to distract myself, the noise filling the silence. But even as I watched the screen, I felt that presence again, the same one that had haunted me in the house. It was in the air, in the way the lights flickered, in the soft hum of the appliances around me. Suddenly, I felt it. The shift. The room seemed to grow colder, the light dimmer. I looked around, my eyes scanning every corner. Then, it happened again, just like before. A shadow, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I checked the windows, locked the doors, and double-checked every corner of the room. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the shadows. I walked over to the mirror on the wall, my reflection staring back at me, a hollow version of myself. And then it happened. For a split second, I saw something, a figure standing behind me. I spun around, but again, the room was empty. Was I losing my mind? Was the house still in my head, tormenting me even after I had left it? The woman in the mirror, had she truly been a ghost, or had she been something else? A warning? A part of something bigger? I couldn't ignore it anymore. The house had left its mark on me. I didn't just break a curse, I had become a part of it. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, it would never truly let me go. The fear that had gripped me in that house, that primal terror, was still with me. It was buried deep, in the pit of my stomach, in the way the shadows seemed to shift and whisper even in the light. No matter how hard I tried to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still with me, that the curse hadn't been broken, but only shifted. I stood there, staring at my reflection in the mirror, the silence pressing in on me until I heard it. A soft, familiar whisper just behind me. "You can never escape." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't just in my mind. It was real, the woman's voice, and she was still here. As I turned, I saw it. The shadow. It was there, just out of the corner of my eye, standing in the doorway. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. The house had followed me, and as the darkness enveloped me once more, I realized with a sickening certainty the curse wasn't over. It had just begun, and I was no longer sure where the house ended and I began. This one begins in a place that many of us take for granted, an old, often overlooked building that most people would never give a second thought. It was in the outskirts of a quiet town, surrounded by old, rundown shops and fading residential buildings. The place had been a part of the community for decades, its brick walls covered in layers of peeling paint, and its creaky floors echoing with the sound of age. The old building was once a community center, a place for people to gather, share stories, and create memories. But over the years, it had fallen into disuse. The paint was flaking, windows cracked, and the smell of stale air lingered in every corner. I wasn't much different from the others, just another worker who had been assigned to keep things running smoothly. You know the type. The maintenance guy, the one who fixes leaky faucet, changes light bulbs, and sweeps up dust in places no one bothers to check. For the past few weeks, I had been the one tasked with overseeing the building's condition. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, really. I'd been assigned to the facility after a round of budget cuts left the community center understaffed, and the building had become a ghost of its former self. No one cared about it, but I had a job to do, so I'd show up each day and carry on with the mundane tasks, minding my own business, never really giving much thought to the building's history or its secrets. My routine was simple. I would show up early in the morning, unlock the doors, and do a quick sweep through the building to check for anything out of the ordinary. At first, it was nothing more than the usual, cleaning out cobwebs, checking pipes, and keeping the building presentable. I was alone most of the time, except for a few brief visits from the occasional contractor or someone from the town council who would come by to make sure everything was up to code. It was a lonely job, but it paid the bills. And for the most part, it didn't bother me. Sure, the building had an eerie atmosphere at times, especially when I'd wander through the hallways late at night with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps for company. But I didn't let that bother me. There was nothing really sinister about it, just a place full of old, unused things. Or so I thought. The building's main hall was large and empty now, though remnants of its former use were still visible in the form of old wooden chairs stacked in one corner and faded photographs that hung crookedly on the walls. The other rooms were mostly used for storage, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten equipment. It was clear that no one had taken care of the place in years. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with a musty scent that clung to everything. But there was something strangely comforting about it, too. A sort of peace that came with knowing you were the only one there, the only one who would walk through the silent halls. For the first few weeks, I barely thought twice about the building. It was just a job, a place that needed a little TLC to keep running. But something started to change in the days leading up to the incident. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it at first. It was a sense of unease, a feeling that lingered just beyond the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until the first strange incident occurred that I realized there was something wrong with that place. Something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the layers of dust and decay. I had been working late one evening when it happened. I'd been alone in the building for hours, walking the hallways and checking for any maintenance issues, when I felt a chill that cut through the air, despite the heat of the summer evening. It wasn't just the temperature change. It was as if something had shifted in the atmosphere. The air had thickened, like something was pressing down on the space around me. I paused for a moment, listening for any sign of disturbance, but all I could hear was the usual creaking of the floorboards and the distant hum of the building's aging air conditioning unit. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling persisted. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the darkened corners of the hallway. But there was nothing there, just shadows stretching out from the dim light above, casting long, unnerving shapes along the walls. I convinced myself it was just the isolation getting to me, nothing more than my mind playing tricks. But then, Something happened that would change everything. That night, while walking through the back storage room, I noticed something odd. The old wooden door at the far end of the room, a door that I had passed countless times before, was slightly ajar. It wasn't opened by much, just a crack. But in a building this old, nothing ever seemed to move without cause. I approached the door carefully, curiosity rising in my chest. The last time I checked, the door had been firmly shut. I hadn't thought much about it, but now, the sight of it ajar felt wrong. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed the door open. What I saw inside would change everything. The door creaked open with an unsettling sound, the kind of noise that feels too loud in the silence of an empty building. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I'd been in this storage room countless times before, and never once had I noticed anything out of the ordinary. The shelves were lined with boxes of forgotten supplies, cleaning materials, old furniture, and various bits of equipment left behind by the community center's previous occupants. Nothing that would cause a second thought. But that door, now cracked open just a sliver, seemed to demand my attention. I stepped into the dimly lit room, my flashlight casting long shadows against the cracked walls. My boots echoed softly on the concrete floor, the sound strangely hollow, as if the room was somehow larger than it should be. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the gap in the door, trying to decide if I should investigate further. I'd been alone in the building for hours, and the eerie stillness had begun to feel suffocating. Every creak of the old structure felt amplified in the quiet. Every flicker of the overhead lights made me second-guess my presence here. I leaned forward, pressing my hand against the door and pushing it open just enough to slip inside. The room was cluttered, as it always had been, but now there was something different. A faint smell, one I couldn't quite place, hung in the air, a mixture of must and something older. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd ever noticed the smell before. It seemed out of place, like something had been sealed in here for years, untouched and forgotten. I moved cautiously through the room, scanning the shelves for anything that seemed unusual. The boxes were stacked high, some of them marked with faded labels that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. It was then that I saw the small, worn wooden chest sitting on a shelf in the far corner. I had no memory of ever seeing it before. It wasn't the type of thing you'd expect to find in a maintenance storage room. It wasn't just a box, it looked like something older, something that didn't belong. I felt an odd sensation, a tightness in my chest, as I approached the chest. There was a strange magnetism to it, like it was calling me. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering just above the lid. Part of me knew I should leave it alone, but the pull was undeniable. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out, lifting the lid slowly. Inside, the chest was empty, save for a single piece of old, yellowed paper. It looked like a letter, its edges frayed, the ink faded with time. I carefully unfolded the paper, holding it up to the light to make out the words. The handwriting was elegant, but the message itself was strange, almost nonsensical. It read, "The walls remember. They wait." The words sent a chill down my spine. It felt like a riddle, a warning, but there was no way to know for sure. I stared at the paper for a long moment, trying to decipher its meaning. I felt a strange sense of unease, like something was watching me. But when I turned around to glance back at the room, everything seemed as it should be silent, still, and untouched. I put the letter back in the chest and closed the lid, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something that should have stayed hidden. As I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, the building seemed to shift around me. The air grew heavier, and the silence deepened, almost suffocating. It was as though the room had become a place out of time, a space that didn't belong to the world I knew. I had to leave. I didn't want to be here any longer than necessary. But just as I was about to turn and leave the room, something else happened. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, soft but distinct. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, was someone else here? But how? I had locked all the doors before starting my rounds, and there had been no cars in the parking lot when I arrived. I should have been the only one here. I waited, listening intently for any sign of movement, but the footsteps stopped. A heavy silence followed, one that felt almost too quiet. I slowly crept toward the door, carefully peering into the hallway. There was no one there. The corridor outside was empty, just the faint hum of the building's aging air conditioning unit. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breath. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the stress of being alone in this place for too long, or the strange sensation that had overtaken me in that room. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of dread. I finished my rounds quickly that night, not wanting to linger in the building any longer than I had to. But something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that whatever I had stumbled upon in that back room had set something in motion. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel it in the air. Something was watching, waiting, just beyond the edges of my perception. As the days passed, the strange occurrences only intensified. At first, it was small things, flickering lights that never seemed to stay on, doors that creaked open by themselves, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I brushed it off as nothing more than the quirks of an old building. After all, places like this have their strange noises and odd happenings. The walls settling, pipes groaning, and wind whistling through cracks are all just part of the charm. But deep down, I knew there was something more. The unease I felt every time I entered the building grew, and soon it wasn't just the strange events that bothered me, it was the silence. The oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound, leaving me with nothing but my own racing thoughts. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, I was locking up the building when I noticed something strange. The back door to the storage room, the very one I had closed so carefully just hours before, was wide open. I froze, my hand hovering over the lock. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I had left it open. I was sure of it. I approached the door cautiously, peering inside. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The chest, the one I had placed back on the shelf, was now sitting in the middle of the floor. The lid was open, and something dark and sticky had spilled out from inside. I stepped back, my mind racing. What had happened? Had someone else been in here? I couldn't make sense of it. I quickly closed the door and locked it, but as I stood there in the dark hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Something was in that building, something that didn't want to be found, and I had no idea just how far it would go to keep its secrets hidden. It was a week after the chest had mysteriously moved, and the strange occurrences around the building had only intensified. At first, I thought it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. The flickering lights, the odd noise late at night, the feeling that someone was always standing just behind me, these were things that could be explained away. But soon, these events became harder to ignore. Every night, I stayed later than usual, doing routine checks. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on my work, something always felt off. There was a constant chill in the air, and it wasn't the kind that came from the outdated HVAC system. It was something colder, more unnatural, as if the building itself had become a place where warmth had no place. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The hallway leading to the back storage room was where it was most pronounced. The shadows that flickered and danced around corners never seemed to move according to any logic I knew. The walls creaked, the floor groaned, and the stillness in the air pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The sense that something was wrong had grown so strong that I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, as I walked past the storage room, I heard a soft scraping noise coming from inside. It was faint at first, like something dragging slowly across the floor, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. My heart raced in my chest as I listened, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. My breath caught in my throat when I realized that it was coming from the same corner of the room where the wooden chest had been sitting. I took a deep breath and gathered the courage to open the door. The hallway light flickered as I turned the knob, casting a brief, almost sinister shadow across the door frame. Stepping into the room, I was immediately hit by that same cold, musty smell, even more pungent than before. The chest was sitting exactly where it had been before, but now it was slightly ajar. The lid was askew, and something dark as stain was visible on the inside, as if something had been spilled there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that covered the floor. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shelves and corners, but there was no sign of anyone else. I was alone, and yet I could still feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached for the chest, hesitant but compelled to look inside. The dark stain on the chest was sticky and appeared to have seeped into the wood. I recoiled for a moment, but then, against my better judgment, I opened the chest fully. What I saw inside made my stomach lurch. The yellowed piece of paper, the one I had carefully placed back inside the chest days before, was gone. In its place was a small, tattered book, its cover dark and worn, as though it had been lying forgotten for decades. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The pages were yellowed and brittle, and the cover was embossed with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. I flipped it open, scanning the first few pages. It was written in a language I couldn't make out, a series of symbols that twisted and curled in ways that seemed almost alive. My skin crawled as I flipped through more pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The further I went, the more it felt as though the words on the pages were reaching out, pulling at my thoughts. I had to stop myself, forcing the book closed. Something told me not to read anymore, not to try to understand what was inside. I placed the book back into the chest, and as I did, I couldn't help but feel a shift in the room. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the building was closing in around me. The sensation of being watched was more intense now. I could hear it, the faint rustle of something moving, just out of my line of sight. I turned around sharply, my heart thumping in my chest. There was nothing there, just the dim light of the hallway stretching out into the shadows. I rushed to close the chest and left the room quickly, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. My hands were shaking, and I had to steady myself against the wall as I walked down the hall. The more I tried to rationalize the events, the less sense they made. It was like the building itself was alive, and whatever was inside that chest had woken up. The following days were a blur of strange, escalating incidents. It wasn't just the storage room anymore. The entire building had become a place of unease. In the middle of the night, I would hear tapping noises from the walls, like someone was knocking on them from the inside. Sometimes, when I passed by the bathrooms, I would catch glimpses of something moving just out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't enough to fully see, but it was enough to unsettle me. Shadows seemed to follow me, darting from one corner to another, vanishing when I turned to look. The sounds of footsteps would echo through the empty hallways, but when I checked, I would find no one there. I started taking different routes through the building, trying to avoid the worst of the areas. But it didn't seem to matter. It was everywhere. The walls whispered, the floors creaked beneath my feet, and the very air felt charged, heavy with something unseen. And then, one night, I walked into the break room and found something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the floor, was a message scrawled across the wall in what looked like dark, smeared paint. It was the same strange symbols from the book, the same language I didn't understand. The message was clear though, even if I couldn't read the words. It was a warning. The symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting in ways that made my eyes ache. It was as though they were alive, the ink itself vibrating on the surface of the wall. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I backed away slowly, my mind racing to make sense of it all. The building was alive. The chest, the book, the symbols, it was all connected. But what did it mean? What was it trying to tell me? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the symbols dancing behind my eyelids. I heard the tapping on the walls, the whispers in the dark. I knew then that I couldn't stay much longer. I had to leave to get out of this place before whatever was here reached out and pulled me in. But I couldn't just leave. I had to know what was happening. what was really behind all of this. And so, the next day, I made up my mind to investigate further. I couldn't let this go. I had to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. Little did I know, that decision would bring me face to face with something far worse than I could have ever imagined. The days following my decision to investigate the strange happenings in the building blurred together. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The creeping sense of dread that had been building over the past weeks now felt like a constant presence. Each time I stepped into the building, I half expected some force to reach out and grab me. But nothing could prepare me for what was coming. It was late one night when the strange occurrences escalated into something far darker. I had been working long hours, trying to gather enough courage to explore the attic, the one place I had avoided up until now. The old building had an attic, but it was a forgotten part of the structure. I had never needed to go up there before, and no one had ever mentioned anything unusual about it. But after the messages on the walls, the whispers, and the moving shadows, I knew I had no choice but to face whatever lay hidden in that dark space. That night, the building felt even colder than usual. As I made my way down the hallway, the temperature dropped, and the air turned thick and almost suffocating. The hallway lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, but the flickers only seemed to intensify, as though something was draining the electricity from the air itself. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming now, like 1,000 eyes were trained on me, waiting, expecting me to move. I reached the staircase that led up to the attic. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing through the stillness. The higher I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. My heart beat faster, and my breath quickened as I reached the top. At the top of the stairs was a narrow door, its wood warped and aged, its surface cracked as though it hadn't been opened in years. There was no handle, just an old brass latch. It looked innocuous, but I knew better. I had to push through. I stepped forward and lifted the latch, hearing a loud, screeching sound as the door creaked open. As it swung inward, I was greeted by the thick smell of mildew and dust. The attic was small, cramped, with low ceilings that felt like they were closing in on me. There were boxes stacked in every corner, their contents long forgotten. Old furniture, covered in dusty sheets, sat in the farthest corner, waiting to be rediscovered. But what caught my attention immediately was the far wall. In the dim light of the single bulb overhead, I saw it, a large wooden door, much older than anything else in the room. It was positioned near the back of the attic, partially obscured by boxes and debris. It was odd. Why had I never noticed it before? The door was old, and the wood was weathered, but it was pristine compared to the rest of the attic. My heart raced as I approached it, each step feeling heavier than the last. There was a lock on the door, but it wasn't a typical one. It was intricate, almost ornamental, with symbols carved into the wood around it. Symbols that looked eerily familiar. The same symbols that had appeared in the message on the wall. The same symbols that had been written in the book I had found in the chest. My breath caught in my throat as realization hit me. This was no ordinary door. It was a gateway. A doorway to something far darker than I had ever imagined. With trembling hands, I reached for the lock. It was cold to the touch, almost impossibly so, as if it had been untouched for centuries. I fumbled with it, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to stop. But something urged me to keep going. Something told me that I had to open it, that I had no choice but to face what was behind that door. Finally, with a sharp click, the lock released. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the room beyond. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, so thick that I could almost taste it. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I could feel something malevolent lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And then, as if in response to my presence, the lights flickered. For a split second, the room lit up, revealing the true horror that lay inside. The walls of the room were covered in the same strange symbols, etched deep into the stone, as though they had been carved there by something far older than human hands. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was covered in dust and grime. but it was what lay in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadows. At first, I thought it was a person, but as the light flickered again, I saw that it wasn't human at all. It was something other. Its form was a shifting mass of shadows, its body contorting in ways that defied reason. Its eyes were glowing, burning with an unholy light, and as they locked onto mine, I felt my entire body freeze in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature's mouth opened, and a voice, low and guttural, echoed through the room. It was a language I couldn't understand, but I could feel its meaning deep within my soul. It was an ancient, forgotten tongue, one that spoke of things beyond comprehension, beyond the very fabric of reality. The words reverberated in my mind, twisting my thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. Fear gripped me like a vice, and I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over debris on the floor. I knew then that this was no accident. The book, the chest, the symbols, they were all part of this. This creature, whatever it was, had been waiting for me to find the door, waiting for me to open it. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. Panic surged through me as I scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The creature moved closer, its body twisting unnaturally, its glowing eyes burning into mine. Its voice echoed louder now, the words growing more insistent, like a call to something darker, something primal. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the temperature dropping to an unbearable degree. My skin felt like ice, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, like it was pulling at me, sucking the life out of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched for a way out, any way to escape. But there was nothing. No escape. Then, in that moment of sheer terror, I heard a sound of voice. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, clearer, until I recognized it. It was a voice I had heard before. It was my own voice. But it wasn't coming from my mouth. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. It was the voice of something that had been here before me. Something that had been trapped in this place, just like me. And then, in a burst of pure terror, the lights went out completely. The darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness pressed against me like a living thing, smothering every ounce of light, every sense of reality. My breath was ragged, and the sounds of my heartbeat seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. It was as though the world around me had dissolved, leaving only the deafening presence of something I couldn't name but feared with every part of my being. I couldn't move. My limbs were paralyzed, weighed down by the oppressive air, but somehow I managed to force myself to breathe, to think, to exist in the moment. The creature's eyes were still burning into me, but now the whispers, my own voice, echoing from the walls, grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of silent screams. In the endless blackness, I stumbled backward, my body slamming into something cold and unforgiving. The wall. The weight of it hit me like a physical blow, but instead of offering any comfort, it seemed to push me deeper into the abyss, further into the creature's pull. And then, as if by instinct, I raised my hand, feeling for the latch on the door. My fingers brushed against it, cold as ice, and I grasped it with desperate hands. It took every ounce of my strength to yank the door open, but when I did, a surge of light spilled in, harsh and blinding. The creature, whatever it was, let out a sound that could only be described as a primal screech, an unearthly noise that echoed through the room, reverberating against my bones. It was a cry of rage, of frustration, of something beyond understanding. But I didn't wait to see if it would follow. I threw myself through the door, not caring about the consequences, not caring about anything except getting away from that thing. I scrambled down the narrow stairs, my mind in a blur, my hands shaking so violently I could hardly grip the railing. The building felt like it was alive, shifting, groaning beneath my feet, as though it, too, was trying to push me out, to rid itself of whatever had come through. When I reached the bottom, I didn't stop. I ran through the building, my feet pounding the floors, my breath catching in my throat, every door I passed slamming open and closed behind me. It was as though the building itself was alive, reacting to my desperation, but I couldn't focus on that. I had to get out. I had to escape. The fear that had seized me in that room was still fresh, and every step felt like it was dragging me closer to the thing I had left behind. I reached the exit, my hand grasping the door handle, but just as I was about to push it open, a familiar voice, stopped me. It wasn't my own voice this time. It was someone else's. Someone who had been there, somewhere in the depths of the building. The voice spoke my name. I turned quickly, my heart lurching in my chest. But no one was there. The building stood silent, the eerie hum of the lights above the only sound. The door remained closed. My mind reeled, but the pull to leave was stronger than anything. I pushed the door open with all the strength I had left and stumbled out into the cold night air. For a moment, it was just the sound of my heavy breathing, the chill wind biting at my skin. The world outside felt distant, detached from the nightmare I had just left behind. I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I looked back at the building, the source of all my fear. The building still loomed, dark and silent, a hulking structure that seemed to hold secrets I couldn't even begin to comprehend. But I was free, or so I thought. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I had escaped. I moved to a small, temporary apartment, keeping to myself and avoiding contact with anyone who might question me. I knew I couldn't explain what had happened, not to anyone. There were no words for it, no way to make them understand. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. At night, I could hear whispers just beyond the edges of my sleep. Faint murmurs, my name slipping through the darkness like a shadow. The sounds were always there, whether I was awake or asleep. I couldn't escape them, couldn't silence them. I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me, as the trauma of what I had witnessed still lingering in the back of my mind. But then, it happened again. I woke one night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My eyes shot open, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, feel the weight of it pressing down on the air. It was there, watching, waiting. I reached for my phone, but it was gone. My hands trembled as I searched the room, but it was as if the figure had erased everything except its presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Vanished. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't slept well since. The weeks passed in a haze of anxiety and fear, each day dragging me deeper into uncertainty. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really seen what I thought I had? Had I really heard those whispers, or was it just my mind, unraveling under the weight of the terror I had experienced? The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I found myself second-guessing everything I had done, everything I had seen. But then one evening, I found something that confirmed the worst of my fears. It was a small, weathered journal, tucked away in a drawer of the old desk I had bought after leaving the building. The journal was filled with sketches, detailed drawings of the same symbols I had seen in the building, the same ones etched into the walls of that hidden room. But there was something more. In the margins, under the sketches, were notes. Notes in the same language I had heard whispered to me in the darkness. The same language the creature had spoken. I froze, the weight of it crashing down on me. The journal had been here the entire time. I had bought the desk from an antique store, one that had been around for decades. It was impossible to ignore the truth any longer. The things I had encountered weren't random. They were tied to something much older, something far more sinister. I closed the journal and set it aside, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something much larger, much darker than I could ever understand. The building was gone, but the terror hadn't left. It had followed me. It had never let me go. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew deep down that the thing in that attic was still there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to return. I may have escaped, but the real question was, could I ever truly leave? The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, an unbroken dark sky stretching far beyond the horizon, with only the faint hum of the city in the distance. But as I sat in that dimly lit apartment, staring at the pages of the journal, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was drawing closer, just out of reach, lingering in the shadows, waiting to make its presence known once again. My mind couldn't process what had happened, what I had experienced. The sheer magnitude of it all was too much. The symbols, the whispers, the creature. It had all been too much for me to fully comprehend. But as the days passed and the terror began to fade into a numb sort of routine, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could finally breathe again. I threw myself into my work, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. But there was always a part of me that felt haunted, as though something had slipped beneath the surface, leaving its mark, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Even now, as I sit here, writing this final reflection, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting for the right moment to return. I thought about that night, the night I finally left the building. I thought about the dark shape, the whispers, the feeling of being trapped in a place where the air itself seemed to pulse with fear. The journal still sits on the shelf beside me, its pages worn and faded, the ink now smudged in places from my shaking hands as I tried to understand what I had read. I had seen the symbols before, but they weren't just marks on a wall. They were a language, a communication from something ancient and otherworldly, something that had always been there, buried in the forgotten corners of the world, waiting for the right time to resurface. I have no answers, no closure. I know that what I experienced was not a simple nightmare or a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was terrifyingly real. And as much as I tried to convince myself that it was all in the past, that I have moved on, there's an undeniable truth I cannot ignore. The building, the creature, the whispers, they're still with me. There's a part of me that wonders if this is my punishment, a kind of eternal reminder of my encounter. Maybe the creature was never confined to that building. Maybe it had always been there, moving between the cracks of reality and dreams, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon it, to discover its existence. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something older than the world itself, a force that cannot be understood, that has always been part of this world, just beyond our reach. I can't escape it. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it's always with me. The whispers, the eerie feeling that something is watching me, that I am never truly alone. It's always there, just out of sight, just on the edge of my mind, as though the creature is still waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. The creak of the floorboards in the room beside me. The faintest echo of a voice, my name whispered in the dark. It's always the same. It's always just close enough to make me question whether I am still trapped in that nightmare, or whether I am simply too far gone to escape it. And yet, there is one thing I can't ignore. The journal. The last entry, the final words written in the margin, just before the ink fades to nothing. It says, "It's never over. It's always watching. It will return." I can't stop thinking about those words. They linger in my mind, a constant reminder that whatever happened in that building wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't something that could be shrugged off or forgotten. The entity, the thing I had encountered, was not just an isolated creature. It was part of something much larger, something that existed long before any of us, and something that would likely outlast us all. And in a way, that is the most terrifying part of all. Because no matter how hard I try to forget, no matter how much time passes, I know that I will always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when the whispers return, when the eyes that followed me that night will be back, watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I can't escape it. None of us can. The world is filled with things we cannot understand, forces beyond our comprehension. And the most terrifying truth of all is that sometimes we are never meant to understand. We are simply meant to experience. The nightmare doesn't end. It just waits for the right moment to come back, to remind us that we are never truly alone. And for me, that truth is the one thing I cannot shake. As I finish writing this, I can almost hear it again. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. And I wonder, will it come from me tonight? Or will I have to wait a little longer? The story may be over for now, but I know it's not really the end. Not for me. Not for anyone. It was an average Tuesday afternoon when I first received the package. Not the type of day that you'd think would lead to anything unsettling. Just a quiet, rainy day in the middle of the fall, with a slight chill in the air. You know the kind. The kind where everything feels predictable, calm, and just the way it should be. I was in my living room, sipping a cup of tea and flipping through a book I'd been meaning to finish. The sound of raindrops tapping against the window created a kind of soothing backdrop to the mundane reality of my life at the time. Let me introduce myself, just to give you some perspective on who's telling this story. My name's David, and I'm in my mid-30s, living alone in a modest apartment just on the edge of town. Not much to say about my personal life. I'm just your typical guy trying to get by, you know? Work, home, repeat. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was a creature of habit. My days always followed the same pattern. I worked as a graphic designer for a small but well-established agency, and like most people in my line of work, I spent far too many hours sitting in front of a computer. But outside of work, my life was calm. Most days I'd spend the evenings either reading, watching movies, or on rare occasions, meeting up with a friend for dinner. I didn't have many friends. That's how I liked it. Quiet, uncomplicated. So, when the doorbell rang on that Tuesday, I thought little of it. My immediate thought was that it might be a delivery I'd ordered, though I couldn't recall anything that was expected to arrive that day. I stood up from my armchair, setting the book aside, and walked over to the door. Through the peephole, I saw no one standing outside, but a plain brown package sat on the welcome mat. No note, no indication of who had left it there. Just a package. Curiosity sparked in my chest, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a delivery that had gotten mixed up. Perhaps it was something a neighbor had ordered, and it was left at the wrong door. I grabbed the package, turned it over in my hands, and looked for any kind of label or return address. There was nothing. Just a plain, unmarked box. A chill ran down my spine at that moment, but I brushed it off. It was probably a mistake. I assumed someone would come by eventually to claim it. But as I stepped back inside and placed the box on the kitchen counter, something nagged at me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, deep down. I wasn't sure why. There was nothing extraordinary about the package itself. But the absence of any markings or any clue as to who it was from made me uneasy. I had ordered a few things recently, but nothing that looked like this. I thought about it for a minute, then shrugged it off. I was hungry, and I hadn't eaten yet, so I made myself some lunch. But as I ate, I kept glancing over at the box. My mind kept drifting back to it. It was like it was calling me. My eyes fixed on it as if the package was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was just my imagination. I couldn't recall ever receiving anything like it before. And yet, the box seemed so out of place in my otherwise ordinary life. In an attempt to ignore the nagging feeling that had settled in my chest, I pushed the thought of the package out of my mind. But as I finished eating, my thoughts inevitably returned to it. It was there, sitting quietly on the counter, like it had been waiting for me. I should have known then that something was off. But I didn't. I decided to open it. That was my first mistake. Little did I know, what I was about to uncover would change everything. The moment I sliced open the cardboard, I wasn't prepared for what I found inside. At first glance, the contents appeared to be nothing more than a tangle of packing materials, bubbles of plastic, crumpled tissue paper, and a couple of foam sheets. But buried deep within this protective mess was something that made my heart skip a beat. A small, worn-out, leather-bound notebook. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an immediate sense of unease when I saw it. It was simple, unassuming, just a small notebook with a faded brown cover. The edges were frayed, and the pages inside looked yellowed with age. There were no markings on the outside, no title, no logo, no writing of any kind. I held it in my hands, almost as if it might explode or disappear if I touched it too much. The first thought that hit my mind was that maybe this wasn't for me at all. Maybe it was meant for someone else, and the box had gotten delivered to the wrong apartment. But no one had come by to collect it. The thought of calling the delivery service and asking about it crossed my mind, but something kept me from doing so, a gut feeling. Instead, I opened the notebook. It was as if something was pulling me to do it, and despite the lingering unease, I couldn't stop myself. I flipped through the first few pages, finding them completely blank. My fingers tingled with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Maybe this was some kind of promotional gift? Maybe it was meant to look mysterious to catch my attention, but was just a clever marketing tactic. As I moved deeper into the book, my stomach turned. At first, the writing seemed like a normal hand, the kind you'd expect to see in any diary, straightforward, unremarkable. The ink was dark and fluid, as though it had been written just yesterday. But as I read on, the words began to make less sense. Do not open what you cannot understand. The eyes will find you. That was the first line that caught my eye, written in large, looping letters at the top of the page. I frowned, not sure whether this was some sort of joke or some bizarre riddle. I skimmed over the rest of the page, but the handwriting quickly devolved into frantic scribbles, barely legible. I snapped the book shut, a cold wave of dread washing over me. My pulse quickened, and I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine again. What was this? Why had it been sent to me? I immediately regretted even opening it. There was something in that book, something wrong. It felt like a warning, a curse. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. I told myself it was nothing, just a prank or some sort of random occurrence. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. After all, who would send a book like that, with no explanation or return address? But the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing about this situation made sense. The delivery, the plain box, the unnerving contents, it all felt so deliberate. But why me? Why was I the one receiving this mysterious package? I wasn't special. I wasn't some kind of target for a weird prank. My hands began to shake as I sat there, staring at the notebook. My mind raced, trying to come up with any reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a mistake, a mix-up with a neighbor's order. But that didn't explain the cryptic message inside. And what was that about the eyes finding me? I turned the book over in my hands, hoping for some clue, some sign that would make it all make sense. But there was nothing. No return address, no contact information, no phone number or email. Just a plain, nondescript object that seemed to belong to someone else, someone who, it seemed, had a much more sinister plan in mind for me. I was sitting there, consumed with confusion and fear, when I heard the faintest sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, a soft tap, tap, tap on the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was someone there? Could it be the person who had left the package? Or was it something else entirely? I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and moved toward the door. I cautiously peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty. No one. I opened the door, half expecting something or someone to be standing there. But there was no one. Just the quiet, dimly lit corridor leading to the stairwell. It didn't make sense. The tapping had sounded so real, almost purposeful. I shook my head, trying to clear the panic building in my chest. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone had been knocking on the wrong door, thinking they were at theirs. But when I looked around, there was no one in sight. I closed the door and locked it behind me, my hands still trembling. I placed the book back on the counter, my mind spinning. The events of the past hour had left me more shaken than I wanted to admit. My thoughts were scattered, and I couldn't focus on anything for too long without being distracted by the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the package, the notebook, or the mysterious message. It was everything. It was the tapping on the door that came from nowhere, the strange sense of being watched even though I was alone in my apartment. I sat back down on my couch, trying to calm myself. I forced myself to breathe deeply and focus. I had to figure this out. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was just overreacting. But as I sat there in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was waiting for me to make a move. And it wasn't going to be good when I did. The days following the arrival of the package were nothing short of unsettling. The strange feeling that had settled in my chest lingered, growing heavier as time passed. Each time I glanced at the small notebook resting on my counter, it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to pick it up again. But I resisted. I couldn't bring myself to open it again, to read more of those cryptic, disturbing words that felt like they were meant to draw me in, pull me into something much darker than I was prepared to handle. However, it didn't take long before strange things started to happen. At first, they were minor, a knock on the door late at night when I was sure no one had been around, the faint sound of footsteps just outside my apartment, the uncomfortable sensation of being watched when I was alone in my room. I told myself it was just my nerves, a side effect of the anxiety that had been eating at me since the package arrived. But as the days went on, the occurrences became harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. It started with the lights. I had a simple routine. I would turn off the lights in my apartment before bed and leave only the lamp by my bedside on. But one night, I woke up to find all the lights turned on. The kitchen light, the hallway light, even the bathroom light, which I never used at night. My heart pounded as I stood there in the dark, staring at the bright bulbs illuminating my apartment. I hadn't turned them on. I was sure of it. I never left them on overnight. I walked cautiously through the rooms, flicking the switches, unsure if someone else had been in my apartment. But the doors had all been locked. There was no sign of forced entry. And that wasn't the only thing. The small notebook, the one that I had carefully put back in its place on the counter, had moved. It wasn't where I had left it. Instead of lying neatly in the center of the countertop, it was now resting against the edge, slightly ajar. The spine was cracked open just enough for me to see a piece of paper sticking out of the pages. My pulse quickened as I walked over to it, my mind racing with questions. Could someone have come into my apartment? No, the doors were locked. The windows were secure. I hadn't heard anything unusual. And yet, there was the notebook, moved, opened. The piece of paper was folded in half, and when I carefully unfolded it, I found more writing. But this time, it wasn't in the same frantic, unreadable scrawl as before. It was much cleaner, the words perfectly legible, but still disturbing. Your time is coming. You cannot run. You will see us soon. The chill that ran down my spine was immediate and icy. My breath caught in my throat as I read those words over and over, my mind struggling to comprehend their meaning. Who had written this? Why was it here? It wasn't just a prank anymore. Whoever or whatever was behind this had been in my apartment, watching me, tracking me. I could feel it. The sense of dread that had settled into the pit of my stomach was no longer something I could ignore. I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. I tried to stay calm. I needed to think logically, figure out what was happening. I was alone in my apartment, far away from anyone who could help me, but I had to at least try. I couldn't just let things spiral further out of control. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but something stopped me. The silence of my apartment was suffocating. I looked around, half expecting someone to appear out of nowhere, but no one was there. Just the same empty rooms, the same dim lighting. I dialed the number for my landlord, hoping for some kind of explanation. Maybe there was something I hadn't noticed, something I had missed. Maybe this was some weird coincidence. But the call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I hung up and put my phone back in my pocket. I couldn't trust anyone at this point. Whoever was doing this, whatever was doing this, wasn't going to let me solve it with a phone call. No, this was something bigger, something more sinister. And that's when it hit me. I had to get answers. I had to know who sent me the notebook, why it was delivered to me, and what the cryptic messages meant. The first step was to find out where the package had come from. I grabbed the delivery receipt from the box and studied it. There was no return address, No company name, no shipping details other than a standard tracking number. I ran the tracking number online, but the results were even more confusing. It showed that the package had been sent from a completely different location, an address I didn't recognize. The company listed was a small, obscure courier service with no information readily available online. It was like it didn't exist. I tried calling the courier service, but the line was disconnected. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do next. Who could I ask? Who could I trust? The days that followed only intensified the eerie events. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was always just a step behind me. The lights flickered even more often, and the knocking at my door became more persistent. At night, I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway, echoing under the silence of the building. I would rush to the door, convinced someone was standing on the other side, but when I opened it, the hallway would be empty. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the notebook was somehow at the center of it all. It had started as a simple package, a strange gift, a prank, maybe. But now it was a constant reminder that I wasn't safe. I wasn't alone. I had to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for the next strange thing to happen. But as I continued to search for answers, I began to realize that there were no easy solutions. The more I investigated, the deeper I got into something I couldn't fully comprehend. The book was more than just a message. It was a warning. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I could ever escape it. The air in my apartment felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in around me. For days, I had been on edge, unable to shake the sense that something was watching me. The lights flickered more frequently now, and the strange noises had escalated to full-on banging on the walls and doors at odd hours of the night. The footsteps that echoed outside my door were no longer subtle, they were distinct, deliberate, as if someone or something was walking the halls with purpose, knowing exactly where I was at every given moment. I had spent countless hours trying to find some sort of rational explanation for what was happening, but nothing made sense. Every lead I followed turned into a dead end. The courier service I tried to contact had vanished without a trace, and the notebook, the strange messages inside it, had become more cryptic, more menacing with each page I turned. The last entry had been the most chilling yet. Tonight, you will meet them. They have been waiting. It felt like a countdown, a ticking clock winding down towards some inevitable moment, some event that I couldn't stop. I had to confront it. I had to face whatever was coming. That night, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, trying to push aside the mounting fear that threatened to consume me, the knocking started again. It was louder this time, more persistent. Bang, bang, bang. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't a casual knock. This wasn't a neighbor asking for a favor or a delivery driver making a mistake. This was something else, something purposeful. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking as I made my way toward the door. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay inside, to ignore it, to lock the door and pretend like nothing was happening. But I couldn't. I couldn't run from this anymore. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze just inches from it. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, without warning, the door burst open with a force that rattled the entire apartment. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat, my body tense with shock. Standing in the doorway was a man, but not just any man. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes hollow and wide. His skin was stretched tight, his features sharp and unsettling, as if he had been drawn from the very edges of my nightmares. And in his hands, he held a package, a small, unmarked box, identical to the one that had arrived days earlier. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand who he was and why he was here, but the words caught in my throat. The air around me seemed to thicken, like it was filled with something heavy, something wrong. And then, with a voice that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside my mind, the man spoke. "You're not safe," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "They're coming for you." I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stared at him, the fear bubbling up in my chest, rising like a tidal wave. You don't understand, he continued, stepping forward, his eyes never leaving mine. The package wasn't for you. It was for them. They know you've opened it. They've seen you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I took a step back, the reality of what he was saying slowly sinking in. The package. It wasn't meant for me. But why had it been delivered to my door? Why had I been drawn into all of this? Who are they? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. What do they want from me? The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring one. It was twisted, as if he found some sick pleasure in my terror. They want you to join them, he said, his smile growing wider. They've been watching you. They've been waiting. At that moment, the air in the apartment seemed to shift. It was as if something invisible had filled the room, an energy that was oppressive, suffocating. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I stumbled back, my eyes wide with fear, as the man reached out and placed the package on the floor in front of me. They'll come for you soon, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. And there's no escape. Before I could respond, before I could even process what he was saying, the man turned and walked away. Slowly, deliberately, as if he had completed some twisted task and now had nothing else to do. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to understand what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? Was I losing my mind? But the package was still there, resting on the floor, waiting for me. I bent down, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The weight of it felt wrong, unnatural in my hands. And as I lifted the box, a sharp pain shot through my head. It was sudden, blinding, and I gasped, clutching my temple as the pain intensified. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I had to know what was inside the box. Whatever it was the key to everything. It was the only way to understand what had happened, to understand who had been watching me all along. With shaking hands, I opened the box. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. My breath hitched as I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words printed there. Your time is over. The door is open. Before I could even react, the lights in the apartment flickered once more. And then everything went black. I awoke in darkness. The absence of light was suffocating, but it wasn't the kind of darkness you'd expect from a power outage. It felt different, more profound, more complete, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted. The pain in my head still throbbed, a dull, constant ache that reminded me of the terror I had just experienced. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone, desperate to get a glimpse of the time, to make sense of what had happened. But there was no screen, no notification, just static. The phone was dead, completely unresponsive. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What had happened? The man with the hollow eyes, the package, the cryptic message, nothing made sense anymore. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots, but everything felt wrong. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever was waiting for me arrived. I scrambled to my feet, the apartment around me eerily quiet. The silence was suffocating, pressing against me from all sides. I tried to move toward the door, but something held me back. It wasn't a physical force, but something much worse, an instinct, a feeling deep in my gut, telling me that leaving wouldn't solve anything. In fact, it might make things worse. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix this. Maybe I could undo whatever I had unleashed by opening that package. But how? The note inside had been clear. Your time is over. The door is open. What door? And why did I feel like the world was closing in around me? I walked toward the living room, my footsteps barely audible in the oppressive silence. As I entered the room, I froze. The package was gone. The one that had been sitting on the floor, the one that had triggered everything, had vanished without a trace. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, my eyes darting around the familiar surroundings, now feeling foreign, unwelcoming. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtains, desperate to see anything that would make sense of what was happening. But all I could see was the night, dark and still, stretching out for miles in every direction. There were no lights from other buildings, no cars passing by on the street below. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed my apartment. I felt a cold hand grip my chest, my breath becoming shallow as panic set in. Was I the only one left? Was I the last person alive? I turned away from the window, my mind spiraling into chaos, when I heard a soft sound at first, a rustling from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, to find nothing but the stillness that seemed to mock my every move. Then, a shadow crossed the doorway. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was in the apartment with me. I froze, not knowing what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was no escape. The door had been locked when I checked, and I knew instinctively that leaving the apartment wouldn't solve anything. I could feel it. Whatever had been unleashed, it was here now, and it wasn't going anywhere. The shadow moved closer, and I saw him, the man from earlier, the one who had delivered the package, standing in the doorway. His face was as pale as before, his eyes wide and vacant, and in his hand he held something that sent a chill down my spine. A key. The man didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, holding the key out toward me. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. What was he offering me? What did this key unlock? Without a word, he placed the key into my hand. The cold metal seemed to burn against my skin, the sensation spreading up my arm like an electrical current. It was as though the key was alive, its very presence tying me to something beyond the physical world. You have to go through it, the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The door is open. It's time. I didn't understand. The door? What door? My mind was reeling, unable to process the weight of what he was saying. But somehow, deep down, I knew I had no choice. I had to follow him. I turned, my legs unsteady as I walked toward the back of the apartment, where the hallway led to a door I had never noticed before. It wasn't there before. It couldn't have been. But there it was, standing in the middle of the wall, perfectly ordinary, except for the strange, ancient-looking lock embedded in its frame. My breath caught as I inserted the key into the lock, the metal sliding in with a soft click. The door creaked open. I stepped inside, heart pounding, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the light switch. But there was no light, just a cold, dark expanse that stretched out before me, an endless void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I couldn't see where it ended. I couldn't see anything except for the faint outline of the man behind me, his face now expressionless, as though he had become a part of the darkness. You have to walk through, he said, his voice growing faint, as though it was coming from a great distance. They're waiting for you. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape whatever this was. But the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I was plunged into darkness. My breath quickened, panic rising in my chest, as I stumbled forward into the unknown. The air was thick with a foul, metallic smell, and I could feel the walls closing in, the space around me shrinking. My senses were overwhelmed. My mind was overloaded with fear, confusion, and a deep, primal need to escape, but I couldn't. I didn't know where I was going, or what awaited me, but I kept walking. Minutes passed. Hours, maybe. Time didn't seem to matter here. It was as though I had entered a different reality, a place where time and space no longer held meaning. And then, ahead of me, I saw it. A door. A door just like the one I had come through. The key was still in my hand, its cold metal burning against my palm as I approached the door. With trembling hands, I unlocked it and stepped through. The light hit me like a slap in the face. The brightness was blinding at first, but I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the harsh light. And there they were, the people from the package, the ones who had been waiting. And as I looked into their eyes, I realized with a sickening certainty that I would never leave this place. Not alive, not the same. They had been waiting for me all along, and now I was theirs. The room around me was silent, yet it felt as though every inch of space was vibrating with a low, sinister hum. I was surrounded by them, the figures from the package, their hollow eyes fixed on me as they stood in eerie stillness. They didn't move, didn't speak, yet I could feel their presence like an unrelenting pressure pressing down on my chest. I had crossed the threshold of that final door, but the moment I stepped into the room, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Whatever this place was, it wasn't part of the world I knew. It was a realm of shadows, a space between spaces, and I had wandered too far. The figures that surrounded me weren't human, not in the way I had understood humanity. They had the shape of people, but their faces were blurred, indistinct, like something that was only half formed, a fragment of a memory I couldn't quite grasp. And yet, their eyes, those eyes were full of something darker, something ancient. They seemed to see right through me, peeling away every layer of my being until there was nothing left but raw fear. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt as though I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far beyond my control. My throat constricted, my breath came in ragged gasps, but no sound escaped. The very air around me felt thick, like it was filled with 1,000 unspoken words, suffocating me. A figure stepped forward. It was the man, the one who had delivered the package, the one who had unlocked the door. His expression hadn't changed. He was still as cold and empty as before. But now I could see something else in his eyes, something darker. He wasn't here to offer me answers. He wasn't here to guide me out. He was here to claim me. The words that left his mouth were cold, detached, as if they came from a place outside of time. "You've come to the end," he said. His voice echoed in the room, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the walls. "The door is closed. You cannot go back." I wanted to scream again, to tell him that this was all a mistake. I wasn't supposed to be here. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, trembling as the figures closed in around me. Their eyes never left mine, and I could feel their gaze piercing deeper, like they were searching for something inside me that I didn't even know was there. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just some twisted dream or nightmare. This was real. This was happening to me. And whatever this place was, whatever these things were, they were not going to let me leave. The man's expression never wavered as he reached into his coat pocket. I braced myself for whatever was coming next, my heart pounding in my chest. But all he did was pull out a small, ancient-looking book. It was worn and frayed at the edges, as though it had been passed down through generations. The cover was dark, almost black, and there was no title, no markings, only the faintest sense of presence that seemed to radiate from it. He held it out to me, his hand shaking slightly, as though offering it was a burden he could barely bear. "This is for you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's the last thing you'll ever need." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I reached for the book, and the moment my fingers touched it, I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, a realization, a shift in the very fabric of who I was. The air around me grew colder, the silence deeper, and suddenly I understood. I wasn't meant to leave. I wasn't meant to escape. I was never meant to return to the world I once knew. The book had sealed my fate. I felt my body tremble as the room around me began to shift, to warp. The figures closed in even tighter, their hollow eyes now glowing with a dim, unnatural light. They were no longer waiting. They were no longer watching. They were now a part of me, intertwined with my very essence, pulling me deeper into their world, into this place where time had no meaning, where death had no power, and where reality had no place. The door had been opened, and I had walked through it. But now there was no going back. As the last shred of my awareness began to slip away, I felt the weight of it, all the terror, the hopelessness, the undeniable truth that I had become a part of something far darker than I could have ever imagined. I had entered their world, and there was no escape. I don't know how long it's been since that night. It could have been hours or years, or perhaps it's all just a blur now, a faded memory lost in the endless void. What I do know is this: I am no longer who I was. The world I once knew is gone, replaced by this place of shadows, where the door is always open, and there is always someone waiting. If you ever find yourself in a room where the shadows seem to whisper, where the air feels thick with unspoken words, know this: you're not alone. They are always watching. And when the door opens, there's no turning back. I've learned that now, and I fear that you will too.